I'm going to go ahead and get started. My name is Rena Little, and I want to welcome you to a panel about Uprooted. I'm going to share my screen and do a short introduction to the topic as well as to the panel members. All right, can you all see my screen? Okay, great, thank you. All right, so the topic for the panel is uprooted. What does uprooted or displacement mean? How can we reroute through placemaking or placekeeping? Uprooted or displacement. To uproot is to pull something out of the ground, including the roots, or move someone from his or her home or a familiar location. The intensified movement of goods, information, capital, images, and people from around the world provides backdrop for contemporary artists' treatment of the uprooted or displaced in a wide range of contexts. In the most simplest sense, displacement is also the moving of something or someone from a place or position. Human displacement, however, refers to the forced movement of people from their homes or countries of origin. Displacement is also interchangeable with the term forced migration. Human displacement can be a result of many different factors, including disaster, conflict, and development. According to the World Bank, the surge of violent conflict since 2010 has led to historical levels of forcibly displaced people who have fled their homes to escape violence, conflict, and persecution. There are about 79.5 million. Displacement and uprooted can take many dimensions all at once and goes beyond the physical. It involves the emotional, spiritual, and political. Rerouting or placemaking and placekeeping. Placemaking means creating and shaping public spaces through a participatory process with their users. Race, class, poverty, and discrimination, among other things, shape place. Placekeeping is the active care and maintenance of a place and its social fabric by the people who live and work there. It is not just preserving buildings, but keeping the cultural memories associated with a local alive while supporting the ability of local people to maintain their way of life as they choose. Recent times have brought to light that there is a need to reinvest in neighborhoods, neighbors, and communities, and to secure the placekeeping of cultural spaces. Throughout time, artists have participated in discussing um, things that are associated with displacement, such as colonialism, forced removal, confinement, genocide, war, anti-immigration policies, removal, containment, racism. Artists have, this is a contemporary work by Yolanda Lopez, who's the illegal alien here, pilgrim. So she discusses conflict, immigrant rights, erasure, othering, gentrification, homeless. Other artists have talked about opening their borders, being hospitable to certain immigrants, bearing witness to disasters in other countries that have led to displacement, remembering these things, the brutality, the violence, creating some opportunities, Um, of course, there's forced movement, voluntary movement, slavery, middle passage, the sea, whiteness as property, manifest destiny, civilizing, building homes and homesteads. And then in placekeeping, there have been artists that have talked about ways in which people who are displaced, how they continue their traditions in their new homes. I'll talk about this work. This is by Margarita Cabrera, called Uprooted Dreams. It's a site-specific sculptural installation. Um, the goal of the project was to commission an artist to create a community-based work that would enliven the interior space and deepen visitors' understanding of the facility's educational and cultural mission to preserve, create, present, and promote Mexican American cultural arts and heritage. The sculptor Cabrera's artistic practice includes developing workshop productions that stimulate community dialogue and provide resistance to loss of cultural identity and roots within the Mexican American community. Cabrera sees, encourages, and creates intersections between contemporary art and indigenous craft practices. So she pretty much asked wood carvers to come in and teach um, that craft to people. So they learn it and they continue the tradition in this country and participate in cultural production. So it's a way of place keeping and healing that disconnect from things that were familiar. Other artists have documented immigrants that have come here and lost um, their visibility, um, a way of supporting their histories and uh, our ability to encounter them and know their lives. Other artists have documented ways in which we dehumanize people that cross the border. Um, Art provides unique access to the world of the displaced in which people have stories to tell. Their stories awaken in us the ability to imagine things differently through exchange and dialogue. They allow us to wonder, to encounter, and to build relations of understanding by connecting and learning from one another while constructing ways to make and remake ourselves. Wonder exists in the body and mind emanating from a particular object, image, or fragment of text, and crafting the challenge, what next? It facilitates interconnected relations and a sense of place as encounters that hold in them useful anti-colonial practices and narratives. The theme provides us with an opportunity to grapple with complexities in relation to people and places. Since the onset of the pandemic and the emergence of national protests against police brutality, systematic racism, and racial terror, particularly in relation to Black lives, the theme has taken on additional meanings in relationship to teaching and learning in classrooms, as well as rebuilding respect, equity, and care in communities. What experiences do we want to construct for students? How can we contribute through teaching, advocacy, and community building? COVID-19 reveals that teachers are demonstrating bravery and resilience in the face of harsh realities, initiating new forms of online teaching and learning, and generating a sense of community through continued interaction with children. What actions must be taken to address inequities? How can we materially imaginatively situate historical and contemporary struggles against practices of domination? Answers to such questions require us to create and sustain relationships, look beyond borders, and get involved. We will discuss cultural practices and artifacts that value and document the actions experiences, struggles, and achievements of those who have found their way to new places and spaces where they work to contribute meaningfully within their communities. Such activity connects us to a web of movements and actions that construct modes of emplacement. The panel is made up of four speakers. Portia Cobb will begin. She's a filmmaker and interdisciplinary artist and associate professor at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. She will discuss her work, Rooted, the Storied Land, Memory, and Belonging, drawing upon memory and history as a means of confronting forced movement and forgetting. Raul Deal is an interdisciplinary community artist who will discuss how he collaborates within community settings. He's the coordinator of Community Art BA program at the Peck School of Arts at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. After he ends his talk, we'll take a short 10-minute break and then we'll come back. And Sean Justice will get us started. He's a photographer, an art educator, and assistant professor at Texas State University. And he'll focus on internet learning as a creative practice for teaching and learning. And then Dawn Steinecker will follow him. She's an assistant professor of instruction at the University of Texas, Austin. And she researches the city as educator. And she will discuss grassroots organizing and resources for teaching. So I will stop sharing so that Portia Cobb can begin her presentation.
Good evening. I'm happy to be here. I'm going to share my screen and give a little context for the project that I did as an artist in residence at the Linden Sculpture Garden in Milwaukee. Something occurred to me recently that, let me see, I want to share. I think I'll share the Storied Land first. Something occurred to me recently in a, sorry, here we go. Something occurred to me recently in something that was written a while ago by Bell Hooks. And I've always kind of looked at her as a way to kind of map out cultural practice, criticism of African-American art, and also of cultural identity. And one of the things that she shared in an interview with another artist, Carrie Mae Weems, they talked about this concept of biomythography. And I began to think, yes, that's exactly what I'm doing. I'm reimagining, I'm creating my story anew in these places that I don't really belong to. I started thinking about genealogy a lot and of genealogy being fractured for myself as an African-American person. My stories often are telling, are revisiting the knowledge that I have of belonging to Gullah Geechee, which is an ethnic identity of African Americans in coastal South Carolina, Georgia, and parts of Florida. So, you know, as I began to kind of revisit, I'm always revisiting what my thrust is or what interests me. So I was invited to do this project at the Linden Sculpture Garden in response to another project that existed. And that particular project, which is called Eliza's Peculiar Cabinet of Curiosities, is by an artist whose name is Fo Wilson. She resides in Chicago, but she's a sculptor, she's an interdisciplinary, and she created a full-scale cabinet. Calling it a cabinet, people call it a wonder cabin, wonder cabinet, I, in my response, related to it as a slave cabin because I knew that it had dualistic properties. I knew that I could read it one way and another audience might read it another. Um, so I'm relating to the cabinet and to the character that she created, whose name is Eliza. Now, Eliza is a constructed character for her, and I created a binary character that I call Lizzie. And Lizzie is um, based on my great aunt who was Gullah Geechee, born 24 years after emancipation in South Carolina, but definitely would have been living there at the time of Jim Crow. Um, I thought about moving through this open space at Linden Sculpture Garden um, and of tending a garden there. So I created a vegetable garden as a kind of memorial to the women as women as composite characters within my family who would have had what we call emancipation gardens, who would have had subsistence gardens or sustenance gardens. And I began to think of myself becoming very interested in growing food, became very interested in what was on our plate and how that told our story, how it told our story of survival, and how it still provides some memory of the past in the present.
Portia,
This
are
part,
you sharing a screen because we can't see anything?
oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I thought I was. Let me go back up here. It's telling me to stop. What do you see? Just me right now?
I see you right now.
Okay, I'm not sure why it's doing that. Let's try this again. Sorry about that. I knew this was going to happen. Let me see. Share my screen. Share. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Okay. I was talking to this the whole time. I apologize. Um, so as I began to become involved with this project, it's a multi-year project. And so the first task that I had was to create a garden in the yard close to the cabinet. And I thought about the landscapes in the places that I know down south, or what we call down home, in this particular coastal community in South Carolina, um, which my mother grew up on, called Young's Island. So I began to reimagine what I saw there, how people created gardens in their yards, and basically fed their families from those gardens. They also smoked meats. There were also hog pens. Some people had cows. Um, but I was working with the story of the vegetables. And I did a couple of collaborations while there. I wanted to show you this image. I hope you can see it of Eliza's peculiar cabinet of curiosities. So that's one view of it. But we did a number of collaborations while I was involved. I did one where I reimagine or reenact, reperform a story that my mother has told me about my great aunt and of my mother's life growing up in rural South Carolina, and of an aunt who would create activities for the children and to engage them, to teach them to read poetry and to perform poetry. So that particular Aunt Lizzie is who I named the garden for. So it's called Lizzie's Garden. In this image, I'm going to click on it and see if I can make it bigger. Don't know that I will. In this performance, I'm reenacting my Aunt Lizzie as a character that she created for the children that she cared for. She had one adopted daughter, but between her brothers, there were at least 17 kids. So my mother, being one of the older kids at that time, remembers certain things that my grand aunt did. One of which was to create a character called Uncle Pomp. And Uncle Pomp, there were stories about Uncle Pomp, and as a child, I heard these stories kind of in the rearview mirror because I never experienced Uncle Pomp, but these stories were fresh in my mind. I wanted to talk a little bit more about like just the idea of creating my story in a space far away from South Carolina and being on this land and having this cabinet appear. So the cabinet for me reads as slave cabins I've seen on plantations down south. It also reads as what we call praise houses or prayer houses that were built during the antebellum years on slave plantations because they wanted to limit the number of people in a space, Black people who were worshiping. So they created these very small spaces that might only fit 5 or 6 people. So the cabin, I don't have the full scale of it here. You may see it in a video that I'm going to show you a little bit in a few minutes. But it basically reminds me when I see it, it evokes those images. So anything that I did there in collaboration with other artists, I brought artists from South Carolina to work with me, one of which was an indigo artist whose name is Arian King Comer. And she came to live in Beaufort, South Carolina at one point in time after spending time in Nigeria and learning the process of wax resist indigo. Um, I brought her within this story. I wanted her to be a part of it because indigo plantations also existed in South Carolina, and that's why she ended up there. She's very interested in the fact that the indigo plant is still prolific and that the craft of indigo, she wanted to keep the story of those plantations, our interactions with our, as Africans, our ability to do the things that we did. Indigo was one of the commodities that was done on these plantations and kept alive. In this image, you see women who I worked with who are from Milwaukee. They're elders and they form a line dance group called the Jazzy Jewels. And they're wearing garments that were dyed by Arian King Comer. So there's this continuum of the story. I began with Lizzie's Garden. I began to imagine who should be in that space with us. I bring Arian King Comer, and one other person that I brought was a baritone singer and storyteller from Charleston, South Carolina. So I'm thinking of the Storyland, memory, and belonging. And it feels like I'm always trying to find home. In my work, I'm always seeking home. Here I am in Wisconsin. I didn't grow up here, but I've been here 28 years as a faculty member. Um, so just seeing migration, thinking of the story of migration and how fluid that was in my life and in my experience with my mother, moving from South Carolina. She moved from there to New York. My brother and I are born in New York. My mother leaves New York and moves all the way to California. We were the furthest away from family. So every story we had, everything we ate was a memory of that place. My mother cooked certain foods a certain way. We ate rice. There was always a pot of rice on the stove because we were coming from a culture where rice production was prolific. And the Gullah Geechee connection to rice is that when Africans were enslaved or captured and brought to the coastal region, um, they had the skills. They knew how to cultivate rice, and they built the technology that still exists today on plantations that have preserved that technology, so that you can see how they opened the gate or closed the gate to keep out certain waters to produce this rice. And I'll tell you a little bit more about the work I'm continuing to do and what ideas have grown from being a part of this call and response. Another part of what I did was I worked with in collaboration with a chef, and that chef is a culinary historian. His name is Scott Barton, and he happens to teach at NYU. He looks at the history of food. We had a lot of discussions about it, and then we created a community table for our local communities. It was an invited table. We had an evening where our project culminated. He created an historical menu, looking back on the foods that we discussed, and he'd ask me different things. Did you ever eat a bread made of rice? No, I don't remember that. Did you ever use powdered okra? I don't remember that, but we ate okra. So he recreated dessert dishes, things that we still eat, but he kind of went all the way back to show how it was connected to our passage across the diaspora. And these are just images from that particular evening. Here he is candying watermelon rind, I believe. And we had a drink made of hibiscus. He's using rice flour. So it was a very engaging and experiential experience. This is Polly Morris, and she directs the Linden Sculpture Garden. As a curator, I will say of her, like, she gave full range for imagination. I didn't feel that I had any limitations at all. This is Fo Wilson, and she is a sculptor artist who built the cabinet. And we're all involved. These are our guests that evening. At the table, we shared stories. We shared stories of food and of our origins, of memory, and food became such a great way to become connected. You know, we talked about recipes, we talked about things we had eaten or not eaten. Um, People are holding in their hands a menu from that evening. I want to go back to Rooted. I'm going to show you a short video right now of a performance that was done that I worked all year, or actually a year and a half to organize. And this is a story of uh, our family lore of Uncle Pomp, my Aunt Lizzie as Uncle Pomp, which is a very peculiar story and plays well with the idea of Eliza's peculiar cabinet of curiosities.
Never around when Uncle Pop came, but we didn't know that then. And no matter where we were, we would run for Aunt Lizzie's room. It was kind of like our headquarters as children because that's where we learned to sing, that's where we learned poems, and it was like, it was just, and we made peanut butter in there, and we roasted peanuts in there, and Lizzie's room was the front of the house, and all the children gathered in there because Aunt Lizzie did things to attract us and to teach us. He said, oh, Lord, yeah. He said, oh, Lord, yeah. He said, oh, Lord, yeah. He said, oh, Lord, yeah.
Okay, so that is part of the performance. I'm hoping that you all saw that. Can somebody send me a voice or something? Rena?
I'm sorry. Can you repeat what you
I
asked?
wonder if you saw what I projected. I just
Yes,
wanted to,
the film.
okay,
Yes. Mhm.
okay. I'm gonna do one other thing. How much time do I have? Okay. I wanted to talk a little bit about where the work is, what I'm doing now, basically, and how I would, how this work has shifted my attention to landscapes in a different way, I suppose. I'm interested now in telling the stories of place, looking at landscape. I've spent some time on the plantations, on a particular plantation in South Carolina called Cummington. And I walked the grounds of Cummington with second great, the second great grandson of one of the enslavers on my grandmother's side. He invited me to walk the grounds with him and to you know, have that experience. I always wanted to go. I wanted to know where it was. I knew it was in South Carolina, but I hadn't any connection to it. And now it's preserved land. So I was very interested in um, trying to figure out uh, how I felt about that experience. I'll show you a few other things. My mother talks about a concept of seeking, and I'm working on a project now that where I'm bringing in that memory of her as a young girl and spiritual practices that were done on the land. So again, you know, the story of the land being a critical site of, of recreation for me as an artist, for reimagining and adding maybe my own gestures, own ways of re-embodying that story, just as I did as Pomp. Um, Let me go here. I'm hoping that you can still see my screen. So in recent months, I got to go on a cultural exchange to Sierra Leone. In South Carolina, our Gullah Geechee identity is connected to Sierra Leone through the material arts, through linguistics, and that we still speak a dialect there. And I spent time in some of the villages there. What I witnessed was sometimes a rite of passage of girls. And the rite of passage made me think back on my mother sharing her story about seeking. So I became very interested in one of the masqueraders that was involved when we saw these performances of the girls who were about to be isolated from their villages and from their families for a period of 12 months. One of the masqueraders is the only woman masquerader of all the masqueraders that they showed us, the only woman wearing this mask. And she's considered So she's a Sue. And I've seen this mask in museums. I began to understand the meaning of the mask by asking questions about this rite of passage. So the Sue is this woman here, and her eyes are small, her mouth is small, she has a large forehead, and she has small ears. And the reason that she happens to appear that way is that she teaches the girls grace. She teaches them to not repeat gossip, not to listen for, I guess, listen and then repeat negative things, which could be read in a number of different ways. When I hear my mother's story about seeking, she talks about being sent into the woods early in the morning or into the cornfields on the land outside of her home to meditate, and that she's supposed to keep a diary of her dreams because at that point in time, in her church, which is the African Methodist Episcopal Church, she's becoming of age. And so the whole notion of that, or the whole thrust of it, is so that she would become humble. So I'm working on this project, and it will involve other collaborations at Linden Sculpture Garden. And I think I'll end with something that kind of stood out to me recently in my reading, is that, you know, I was thinking about what I do in my work, in this kind of work, of being on the land, of reclaiming history, and of on land that is now, when we have forums like this in academic circles, we have to acknowledge the land that we're on, which I'm not versed in that yet. You know, I've been in other forums where people, you know, they say it at the beginning of their talks. Here I am in Wisconsin, I'm displaced. And I feel like my whole life I've been displaced and trying to find where home is, since my mother doesn't reside in South Carolina anymore. I'm very interested in reclamation and restoration. So the whole thing of biomythography is looking at the cultural context of exile. So that's where I am. I'm always looking at the cultural context of exile. You know, we're wandering. I think of fractured genealogies. If I do my family's history, it is fractured. I can't follow it all back, all 10 generations back. The other thing is that how we look at art in constructed spaces that are brick and mortar, you know, brick and mortar. If we're in a museum, you know, what kind of gaze is brought to art by a predominantly white audience? I think in creating work in open spaces, in plain air, has really helped me to expand how I see myself as a maker and as an interdisciplinary person. And of the cultural genealogy through the image. So I'd like to say that through the connection to Linden Sculpture Garden, the call and response, that I'm responding to one person's idea and expanding on it with my own reimagining of myself within that picture, I think it helps people to reimagine their own stories. And with that, I think I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you, Portia. We will continue with Raul. I also want to point out to all attendees that there is a Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. You can send in questions and we will answer your questions at the end of the panel discussion.
I'm coming on, Rena, just give me a second here. Okay. So I'm Raul Deal. I I guess I coordinate the community art program at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee in the Peck School of the Arts. I'm going to tell some stories. I was really inspired by Portia's her talk about her own exploration of identity and who she is, and so on. I'm going to give you a little personal history before I talk about my work interacting with others. I sort of started thinking about migration as a young child because my grandparents were Italian, and my grandmother lived in this country for 30 years and she never learned English. And my grandfather never spoke very well either, but they were really, really solidly ensconced in their cultural roots. And so I grew up learning about immigration, about the stories of the hardships and how they managed to build a new life in a different country. At the same time, I spent a lot of my youth going back and forth between the United States and Mexico because my father happened to be an academic and studied Latin America. And so I had a little bit of confusion about who I was as well. I went to first grade in Costa Rica. I learned how to write and read in Spanish before English. And so when I later on went to Mexico to live, to do my graduate work in Mexico City, and I stayed for 8 years. I had a whole different experience of this idea of being uprooted. And after I did my graduate work in the city, I moved to the country, and that's where my story starts. This is the state of Veracruz. And Veracruz, in Jico, Veracruz, it was a small town where I lived. This was my neighbor. His name is Don Miguel. And he had this head in front of his gate, and I admired it every time I went by it. I loved it. And finally I went and knocked on his door, and he became a friend of mine. And one day he came to ask me if I would paint that head. And so I told him, it seemed like an honorable request, but it was his, and I didn't really want to interfere on something so personal. He said, "You're an artist, you'll do a lot better job than I do." And I went to paint it. The day I was working on it, he stood out there just like this, like you see him in the photograph. And people would come up and approach us, and he would tell them stories about the head. Like he told one lady that this was an object that was a pre-Columbian artifact from his father's lands. And I said, "Don Miguel," I said, "that can't be true." And he says, "Oh," he says, "yes, it is true." And then somebody else came up. He said, "You see the head on top, but the whole body's buried underneath." And again, what I came to realize is that the importance of this object that he used as sort of an expression of his own creative imagination. And so I started thinking about art in a different way. And during the time I lived in Jico, I was invited to work in the state of Tabasco. And this was an indigenous community. It was a Chontal Mayan community. Spanish was not the first language here. The person that invited me was a Cuban artist named Leandro Soto. And Soto had gone to Tabasco along with many artists and intellectuals as part of a cultural sort of a renaissance in the state, because the governor's wife was the novelist Julieta Campos, who was a Cuban novelist. And so she had sworn that she would put a library in every single pueblo in the state. And Leandro was brought in to use art as a segue to language. And he invited me. And what he did is first he taught them how to paint. And then he told them, go home, get stories from your grandparents and your parents, and bring those back, and let's use that as the source material for our, they called it the taller de creación, the creation workshop. And you can see that the themes that they addressed were themes that were in some way working out their condition of living between two cultures. Many of the men in the community were now working in Villahermosa, which was the capital. They had learned the language. Cell phones and computers were starting to appear. But at the same time, the central part of this image is very traditional, with the gourd, which was used to carry water, the machete, and other indigenous elements. So it became a workshop for cultural transformation, and this interested me greatly. When I got there, they said, you're going to do some wood carving workshops. And I said, do we have any materials? They said, no, we do. We've got a tree. So they cut the tree down. Everybody got a half a log, and there were about 8 of them. And I put them to work to do some wood carving. And you can see the theme of nature, the water theme, in one of the pieces on the right-hand side, which in this case was crucial because the petroleum industry was decimating the water from the state of Tabasco. And so this is a 14-year-old boy who was addressing that theme. They also brought back a cosmology that had been largely forgotten, wasn't being passed down from parents and grandparents anymore. And it involved a person named Cantepec, really a deity named Cantepec. And Cantepec is the central figure on the left-hand side. They still make offerings to Cantepec at different times, seasonal times when they're going to plant or when they're going to hunt or fish. I'm sorry that my presentation is got a mind of its own here. There we go. Another thing that they addressed were the traditional dances, and on the upper right-hand side, that's the danza del caballo blanco. So the children learned how to use paint as a way to work out sort of their own cultural expression and who they were in the world. That for them was changing rapidly. So I left, and then I went back 8 years later, and the children that we had taught now were older, and they had families, and they were doing the same workshops that we did with the community. I ran for 1 week a collaborative art workshop, and you can see us down there working. We were going to do 8 paintings. I said they've got to be 12 feet tall, exhibitable here and in the United States. So first they were excited about it, but then they started questioning me, and they said, you're a sculptor. Are we going to do sculpture? This was 3 days into the workshop. I said, well, we have 3 days left. Do you think we can do something in 3 days? And they said, yes. I said, what are we going to make it out of? And they pointed up. You can see in the left-hand corner of the screen that little thatched roof. They pointed up there, and they said, we can get those materials. So they went out that afternoon, and they cut down some reeds and some thatch, and they brought it back, and that's what we began to work with. And I said, what do you want to do? And of course, they wanted to do the image of Cantepec. So here we are inventing a way to do that in 3 days. Basically, we're lashing it together using a technique that they used in the town to lash together rebar in construction processes. And so this is what they ended up doing. They finished this face. It's 12 feet tall, and they came the evening after it was complete, and they said, Raul, I don't think we want to put it out in front of the school, because if we do, the evangelical faction of the town is going to come and object because they don't like the idol worship. The Catholic faction liked it and supported it. In fact, gave money to the art school that they were building. I said, that's all right. We don't have to do it. We'll keep it out back. But then they came and they decided they wanted to put it out front. They said it would be maybe they would have the possibility of a conversation if anybody objected. And sure enough, within about 10 minutes, they were out there arguing with the mother of one of the girls that was in the workshops. And another 10 minutes passed, and she was in the palapa, in the thatched structure there that they called a school. And they were drinking tea, and they brought her back into the fold. And so I started thinking about Don Miguel's head and this creative inspiration from imaginative storytelling that's spurred by an art object. And the paintings that they did were also a source of contention because they were anxious to show me what they had learned and how they had developed individually as artists. So I said, look, I said, everybody take charge of a painting and we'll do whatever you ask for. And that's the way we handled it. So the image on the left is appropriate for these days because it is an offering for Day of the Dead. You can see the large chalice, incense chalice in the central part, and then the souls coming to the altar or the offering from the back. And then on the right, the central figure was supposed to be Cantepec. But the person that ran that painting said, it's also you, Maestro. He says, and it's the process of our workshop. And if you look, the hands that are holding rings along the center part of the painting, at the top are disjointed and at the bottom are connected. And then the nature themes that they worked with so much. So we brought it to the United Community Center, the Latino Arts Gallery in Milwaukee, and I was able to bring up a couple of the artists that had worked on it, and they went through the same process with young students in Milwaukee at Bruce Guadalupe Community School, and they were students of recent immigrants or children of recent immigrants. And so it was the whole thing came full circle. So I started working at the same time as I was working at the university, I continued working with youth. I found that I enjoyed it a lot because it kept me close to Mexico. And I got a call from the Haggerty Museum, and they asked me if I would do art workshops for youth that were based in an exhibit that they had that's called Caras Vemos, Corazones No Sabemos. You see the faces, but you can't know the hearts. And it's an important immigration collection of art about immigration. And I told them I'd do it if I could bring the youth. And so I brought in some of the youth from the Bruce Guadalupe Community School. They were actually part of a program called the Latino Arts Strings Program. And they were coming from a concert, so they were dressed up in this clothing. The education curator said, I'd like to show you the exhibit, and she started taking them through the different halls, and I waited out front. And she was explaining when they left, and when they came back, they were explaining the exhibit to her. And she said, you know, Raul, this is incredible. I've learned a lot more from them than they have from me. So we went through the similar process of asking them to go talk to their parents and their families or people that they wanted to ask about their immigration story. And we knew when we started this project that it was volatile, and we had to approach it with a lot of sensitivity. And when they came back with photos and with stories, a lot of times it had been the first time they talked to their parents or their grandparents or uncle about immigration. But they did beautiful mixed media pieces about the experience. And here are 4 of them. You can just get a sense of how close they were to the theme anyway. And I'll talk a little bit more about one of these in just a moment. So that experience made me think that I really had to do more. I got involved in the immigration movement, Voces de la Frontera, which is the local immigration rights group that is really effective. And I started going to the marches and taking photographs. And these were going to end up as images that I thought maybe I would use for art making. So in one of those marches, I ran into this guy. And he had this shirt on, and it says on one side in English the same thing as on the other in Spanish. Take only what you need so that others can have what they need to survive. Don't let greed, and then it goes on talking about wealth. And I asked him if I could take his picture, and he said, sure. So I did, and I started a series of woodcuts, and this was the first in the series. So as I got underway with this project, I thought it would be ideal if I could work with families, the ones maybe that had worked with me on the Haggerty exhibit, and do pieces about, gather their stories and do pieces about their stories or about their families. And then they could be gifted. The woodcuts are great for that because you work with multiples. So I started to do the interviews, and I ran it as an undergraduate research project through the University of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, of Wisconsin, Milwaukee. And of course, I had to figure out ways to do this in a safe way that wouldn't put anybody in danger. And this was a recording, one of the early recordings I did. We'd set up a screen. This was a mixed status family. And I'll play you just a short segment of that interview.
Y como mujer uno siempre quiere una estabilidad, una casa, y nos casamos. Me fui a vivir a casa de la mamá de él. En la parte de arriba él construyó y estuvimos ahí viviendo como por un año y medio. Y pero mis hermanas, tenía 2 hermanas aquí en Estados Unidos y siempre nos decían que aquí la vida era diferente, que había más posibilidades de salir adelante, de comprar casa y de que pues que había más trabajo también. Entonces fue cuando una de ellas me dice, ¿quieres venir? Y yo no lo dudé, yo dije, para mí era mi gran sueño es tener mi propia casa y yo dije, a lo mejor allá yo voy a tener mi propia casa con mis hijos. Y esa fue la razón por la cual decidimos pues venir a este país.
So that's a typical immigration story. That's one of the reasons that people immigrate. There were other elements to the story that were much more challenging and difficult. So I juxtapose these 3 images because they're all from the same family. The piece on the top was the image that the woman's daughter, who was born in Mexico, had done. And her little brother on the woodcut is in front of the screen because he was born here and he has his papers. The story that the piece on the top tells is her entry to the United States. When Ellie was a child, she was just over a year old, and her parents had hired a coyote, a smuggler from a family in California, and a lady showed up at the border with a popsicle and a paleta and tricked her into jumping into her arms. And the woman started walking away with Ellie, and her mother said, "What are you doing?" And she said, "Well, you hired me. We have to take her on an airplane. She won't survive a trip in the desert." And she disappeared into the crowd. And so the parents were left for the next 3 months trying to cross over. And you can see the fence on the left-hand side, it says dad, and dad says sí. On the right-hand side, it's mamá, and she's saying no se puede, you can't do it. And it went like that until they finally arrived in Milwaukee to learn that Ellie had been taken to California and they had extorted the family for much more money. And so that was her entry into this country. And I told Ellie when she was younger, when I did this first piece, I said, "I'm really sorry that I can't do something about you, but someday I'll do it." And Ellie turned out, she went to study music at the University of Wisconsin, and she became undocumented and unafraid. And when that happened, and she was very public about it, I asked her if she'd like to do the piece. So we did that. And this is the portrait I did of her. It was exhibited then at the Wisconsin Museum of Art, and it has her story on the bottom, and she showed up dressed like this with her friends and performed in front of it unannounced. So it did mean a great deal to her. So in this project, as I was interviewing families, this was one of my students in one of my classes, and I've known her since she was 12 years old. And Marisela was also an undocumented student. And I said, and she was struggling at university. She was a fine student, but it was a difficult situation she was living. This is pre-DACA years. I said, why don't you come and be my project assistant? And so she did, and she participated in gathering the stories. This is her parents when they were in Mexico and when they were her age with her sister. Marisela was not yet born. Well, I was traveling and I got a text from her and she said, Raul, the most amazing thing has happened. President Obama has, by presidential decree, declared an opportunity for people like me, deferred action for childhood arrivals, it's called, and it looks like I'm going to be able to get a job, a driver's license. I'm eligible for it. So we decided to take a group of undocumented students to Chicago. They were having what they called a dream in. And we arrived, they gathered all their materials for their paperwork. It was going to be at Navy Pier, and Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights had put together a group of lawyers, and they were going to see, I believe they were going to see just about 500 people. That was their limit. By the time we arrived, and it was only about 6:30 in the morning, there were already well over 3,000. And then by the time we left, the count was 17,000. Let me go back there for a second. You can see the lawyers in the middle, the room in the middle, and it was eerily like Ellis Island. None of our people got in, but they all subsequently got their papers, their DACA papers. And in addition, they were energized, we all were, by seeing so many people for the first time come out in the open. So Marisela's image was this one. She wanted to have her DACA papers in it. This is another of the families I interviewed. This was Mr. Duran and his wife. And he was over to the house one day, and I had taken this photograph of him, and I thought I might do his piece about based in this photograph. And I said, come on over, have a look, see what you think. And he looked at it and he goes, bueno, pues lo que usted diga, maestro. Whatever you say, he says. And I was like, but what do you think? And I could tell he didn't like it. He said, well, what are you going to put in the background? And I said, why don't we, I knew he was a poet, a musician. I said, why don't we put one of your pieces in it? And then he got really excited. He was interested. So I said, later that night, I saw him at Fiesta Mexicana. I said, I figured out what I want to use for the song. And I told him one of his pieces, and he didn't look satisfied again. He pulled out a napkin and he'd written something down for me. And so I took that, we used that as the song for his piece. And the interesting thing about it is he already has his papers. He has since the Reagan years. He was here during that initial, what they now refer to as the Reagan amnesty. But in his piece, he wanted to honor those that didn't make it. So I know you're going to want to hear what he sounds like when he sings. Let me go back for a second. It's going to be kind of loud.
Pasando tragedias, siguen muriendo inocentes que cruzan por
So you get a sense of how much he enjoys what he's doing when he's singing these corridos, and the importance of the music actually was cranked up a couple steps, because Televisa from not Televisa, Telemundo from Chicago, the radio, I'm sorry, the television station, learned of the exhibit and wanted to come and interview him and see if he would sing in front of his piece at the opening of the exhibit. So he did, and they had that on their website for a while. He was so proud of it. This is Mr. Ordaz and his daughter. And you can see the piece that Monica did on the bottom, no Mexicans, a foot in the door, and some mariachi has just been thrown out on the street. And I talked to him probably for an hour and a half, and we didn't get anything. Maricela and I were there, and I said, Maricela, why don't we go ahead and pack up? I told him I didn't want to, I was appreciative of his time. And we had things packed up, and he said, Maestro, he said, I have more to tell you. And I said, oh, that's all right. So we took everything out again. And he went on to give me another 15 minutes of the most fascinating stories about his life. So when I did his woodcut, I wanted it to demonstrate how purposeful he was about what he wanted to share, what he wanted others to know. And so when I did this project, I worked with a poet who was from Chile, and she did poems for all the images. And I'd just like to read you the poem for this piece. If you were to ask me, I would tell the secret history of the fields. If you were to ask me, I would sing in Xochitl the song of the cacao beans. If you were to ask me, I would list the many grays of the shadows of the desert. If you were to ask me, I would whistle the sound of the dried river. If you were to ask me, with my bare hands, I would carve the landscape of the pueblo that became dust under my shoes. If you were to ask me, I would name all that has been forgotten. If you were to ask me. I'll tell you about one more from this series. This is my friend Marta. And when I did this image, I was thinking a lot about the DREAM Act, because I was working with all these young students. And I remember that the initial image, which is quite large, you can see the size of it here, was selected for a portfolio about migration that the Just Seeds Collective put out. And when they did it, they wanted me to change one aspect of it because they wanted an image that could be used by many community groups. They wanted me to take out Voces de la Frontera, which is the logo on the Stop the Raid sign. And then they wanted me to take out DREAM Act Now because they said that it was no longer an issue. And I said, well, let's take out Voces, but DREAM Act is an issue for the students that I work with, so that stayed in. So then my friend Nicholas Lampert, who's in the Just Seeds Collective, said, Raul, let's turn it into a mud stencil. And the beauty about mud stencils is that it's mud. So they really can't arrest you for doing this. And the size of this made it really useful in creating spectacle. As soon as we took the buckets of mud out, we were doing this at an immigration march. As soon as the mud came out, the cameras came, and it was heavily documented and circulated on social media. And we pulled it off, and the image isn't particularly strong, but the whole spectacle was quite successful. So this is the evolution of an image that went in unexpected places. Nicholas called me up about a year later. He said, I'd like to help you transfer that to a parachute banner. And this was to be used in a march. And so Nicholas designed the typography, and we got a lot of people to paint it, and then it went out on the streets. And of course, the purpose of the parachute banner is to get the drone shot. And the other value of it is when it rains, everybody gets underneath it. But that's not where it stopped. This is an image of it in City Hall. And they took it to City Hall because the mayor and the city council were entertaining deputizing the police to act as with same powers as ICE agents. And so they took this in protest and they won. So I'm going to tell you one more story. And this is a story of a mural, a recent mural that I did. And before I say too much about it, I want to mention that I'm showing you a lot of work that I've been doing with the Latinx community, but a lot of my work actually, and how I learned to interact with communities, was working in Milwaukee's African American community, the Walnut Way community. And so when I started this project, I had gotten a call from Artworks for Milwaukee. And it's a organization, a community art organization that creates, it's a jobs training program really for youth. And they get them involved with art projects. And in the process, they try to foster job skills. So for this project, they called me and I said that I was interested in it. And one of my collaborators said, why don't we do it about the United Migrant Opportunity Services? This was it's a not-for-profit in Milwaukee, very important, one of the largest Latinx service organizations certainly in Wisconsin, and with a national reputation. So they advertised the mural among the high schools. For 10 positions, they got over 100 applicants. And out of those, I interviewed 20. This was my crew. And I would have taken them all. But I could only have 10. And I had university students in the undergraduate research program involved also. So I had envisioned a tiered mentorship program. And the first thing we did was got to know one another. We had to make the sketchbooks we were going to use to house the creative explorations for creating the mural. We went to the archives to learn about the history of this organization. It was a fascinating history of Latinx activism in Milwaukee. Part of the reason that I wanted to do that also was to get youth in the university on campus, so they might see themselves there. This is one of the documents from the archives. So in the story we told, this comes to play. I'll bring it up when we get there. But these are the women that were involved in organizing education at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee for the Latinx students. They gave us a liaison. His name was Jesus Salas, is Jesus Salas. And Salas was a migrant worker. He came, he organized in the migrant camps. He's the person that connected us to all of the activists that we were able to interview. And he's a great storyteller. And he's a teacher himself, taught at Milwaukee Area Technical College for many years. And he was even a regent for the University of Milwaukee, Wisconsin-Milwaukee. So he was a great source and told all of us lots of stories. But one of the stories that I wanted to share solved an issue that I wasn't sure how I was going to address. And that is, half of my students were African-American and half were Latinx. And I wasn't sure that the history of Latinx activism was going to engage everybody. But when he told his story about how he became an organizer, it was marching in the fair housing marches in Milwaukee with Italian priest named Father Grappi and Belle Phillips and all of the great civil rights activists from Milwaukee in the African-American community. And so after that story, we had everybody engaged. I'll let you hear a moment from Jesus.
I'm a third-generation migrant worker. Got up here to Wisconsin as a farm worker with my father and my brothers. Relocated in 1959 after 10 years working in the fields. conditions of migrant workers. The 10 years that I worked here in Wisconsin did not improve over the years. And so we protested the working and living conditions 50 years ago this summer, or that is in 1966.
I'm going to stop it there because I have a little bit more to share. I had the youth do lino cuts to start with. And part of the reason for that, again, it was just to get to know one another and to give them, get an idea of what their skills might be, and also to help them with drawing skills. We turned these also into t-shirts. Here's one of them on the, well, a few of them. You can see what they ended up looking like. So in gathering imagery for the mural, we went to the Yumos Festival on the Yumos parking lot that they have every year and took some photographs. We finally got a hold of the Union Art Gallery that generously over the summer let us use their gallery to paint the mural onto parachute fabric. It's called Polytab. So we used different transfer techniques, and the youth really got into this aspect of it. It got a lot of press, started getting press, and so people said, why don't you do a little promo? So we did this one. Again, it'll be a little loud. So the reason that that's important in this context is that we're working on a building that's on the south side of Milwaukee. It's a community that has a sort of a few different groups, but right now the main group there is Latinx. The main population is Mexican. And we're trying to demonstrate that there's something happening which in some way is going to be interesting to them. And since the media was asking for it, we circulated that. I'd like to show you a few of the images from the mural, and so you see how we told the story. The arrival of the migrants on the left, the marches that Jesus organized. The first one was actually from Madison to Watoma, from Watoma to Madison. And that was a couple days they had to walk. And that was to organize the right to organize in migrant camps. So this is Jesus Salas, and the way the story goes, Yumos was founded during the Johnson years and the war on poverty, when many not-for-profits were funded. They weren't satisfied, the migrant organizers, with the attention that they were giving the political issues and the social issues they were struggling with. So there was a hostile takeover it, and Jesus Salas became the first Latinx director of Yumos, executive director. And his colleague on the right-hand side, who's the current director, is Lupe Martinez. I talked to you a little bit about the lino cuts we did, and one of the students wanted to put the sun, which comes from a game called Loteria, which is like Mexican lottery. She wanted to put that in the mural in her image as well. And the reason she wanted to do it was because it referred, she said in her family, when they played Loteria, when they were done, the back of the cards all had a sentence or two that was instructive, like a lesson. And in this case, the back of the sun is La cobija de los pobres, or the blanket of the poor. And she thought that was important. So the left side of the mural is the agrarian aspect. The right side of the mural is the urban aspect. So UMO started trying to get workers hired in Milwaukee so that they could raise a family, have a good job, union job, and they could get them jobs, but they couldn't get them in all of the places because they were discriminatory. So they organized in the foundries and the breweries, and that worked out well, but they weren't educated, so they couldn't get the good jobs. So they organized education. And they did this at UWM. At the time, there were only about 11 people that were Latinos at the table. And they actually, out of that, they got eventually the Roberto Hernandez Center, which is now still in operation, at the service of the university for Latino students.
We tried to be purposeful about making that clear what the stories were about by including headlines from different moments in history. And that was important also to us because, you know, there are lots of versions of history. And if we can use the words of the reporters that followed it, like Joe Sandin, who was one of the principal journalists at the time, that recorded the migrant movement, if we can use those as a way of enhancing the understanding of the general public of what happened, and that's valuable.
It seems like it was 50 years ago when they were marching from Watoma to Madison, and now you have the same people marching for other reasons, which is human rights, right?
Something that frustrates me all the time is like, why are we still fighting for this? You know, it's all these years later. But Marla Anderson's daughter was like, because we have to. I told her that. I was like, Marla, it's just so frustrating. Why am I sitting here fighting for the same stuff that you guys were fighting for, you know? And she's like, mija, it's because you have to, you know? We have to. We can't afford not to.
So those were some of the undergraduate research assistants that were working with me. And then here are a few of the images. The Fiesta Mexicana was important to Jesus Salas, he said, because that's a political activity. In Mexico, we have festivals, they have political currency. And then we put the participants in the mural as well. I have to say, looking at that, no justice, no peace, Wisconsin is not Arizona. Well, maybe it's changed now after today. So that was done when Arizona was restricting ethnic studies. That was in process. There's a finished one. Here's the mural going up. This is a technique that if any of you are educators, you can use with students. You paint it on the poly tab, and then it actually gets glued to the wall, and it's as permanent as a regular mural. This is what it looked like when we were done. And the last thing I want to tell you about this mural is when I hired or interviewed Fatuma, I asked her, why do you want to work on a mural about the history of Latinx activism? And she said, well, she says, I'm a refugee. She says, I'm a refugee from Kenya. And my people have suffered in similar ways. And I have to learn about how they've suffered and the challenges they have, because I'm also going to be learning about myself. And I found out that she liked to write. And so I asked her if she would write something to go on the mural. And this is what she wrote: to immerse myself in this foreign setting means not to forget the pleasantries of my own, for my identity is engraved and encrypted into my blood. And we did put it in the mural. So I'm going to end with this. I told you the story about the mud stencil at the immigration march. While we were doing that, I ran into the teacher at the Bruce Guadalupe School, my friend Jacobo Lobo. And he was with all his students. It was during the class period. And I said, Jacobo, shouldn't you be teaching? He said, I am teaching. And I went a couple days later out in front of the school, and they were all doing a mud stenciling project. And I saw this, I took this photograph, and I later tried to find where that quote came from. I looked it up on the web and I couldn't find it anywhere. So I called up Jacobo and he said, oh, he said that came from the journaling that the kids did. You can't break us, we are linked. And so if there's anything in my mind that's hopeful in our society today, it's this idea that our stories have things in common. And one of the wonderful ways to get them out is through art. And you can do that with challenging realities in all sorts of settings. So I'll end there.
Thank you, Raul. We're going to take a 10-minute break and come back for the last two panelists and the Q&A. If you have questions for any of the panelists, can you put them in the Q&A segment instead of the chat? Thank you. Good.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Want me to start now?
Yes, please.
All righty. Well, hello, everybody. And thank you very much for inviting me, Rena and Andres and Texas Tech. So I'm Sean Justice. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. And if y'all could let me know if it shows up, that would be great. How's it looking? How's it looking out there in Zoom land? Are you seeing the title slide?
Yes.
Okay, terrific. Well, I'm really pleased to be here, and thanks so much for inviting me to talk about the topic and the ideas. I'm kind of honored and blown away to be talking with next to Raul and Portia. I so admire your work, and it's so great to hear more about what you're doing and how you've come to be doing it. So thank you to you both for sharing what you're doing. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about my work and a little bit about who I am. I think I'll begin by introducing myself just a bit. And then I'm gonna share a little bit about some contemporary work that I'm doing right now. And I will, at the end of after sharing, at the end, I would like to put together some thoughts. I've put together some thoughts. They're exploratory thoughts about how this kind of work matters or might matter. I'm really curious. It's an exploratory proposition. So as an artist, I work with computational materials, and Rena introduced me as a photographer earlier. And true enough, I suppose, I was a photographer. I used to be a photographer for 25 years. I was a commercial photographer living in New York, and editorials and advertising. And that really was my life for a very long time. I no longer even own a camera, actually, of any type except for my iPhone. So I don't introduce myself as a photographer any longer, because I feel like if I did, a reasonable next question would be, can you show me some of your photographs? And I really don't have any photographs that I consider to be current work. However, I do work with computers. I work with computational materials, and I suppose it's fair to say that I have a photographic mindset around representation and around reality, or about the skewed reality that cameras sometimes produce. But I am really very involved in education, and I teach art education at Texas State University in the School of Art and Design, but I'm also very much involved in computer science education. And in that regard, I consider myself a learning science researcher. I'll talk a little bit about how this all comes together. I hope I tend to get a little bit sidetracked as my thoughts wander through presentations of this type. So forgive me if somebody in the chat, somebody nudge me back on course if you wouldn't mind. The questions that really I'm very much engaged with today around learning design and the design of classrooms, pedagogies, curriculum, community education. This question about innovation and how it emerges within communities built on equity is something that indeed really does keep me up at night. This is the focus of my work these days. This is somewhat new work for me. And I should say that my own journey through my life has taken me in a lot of different directions, and recognizing the idea of land and landscape and where bodies come from in land. I find myself uprooted constantly. Portia mentioned the idea about don't know where home is. That's something that I say to people who inquire all the time. I don't really know. I'm not really sure. I'm not from Texas. I'm new to Texas. The last 4 years I've been here. I consider New York City to be my home. That's where my family is from. But I was born in Kotzebue, Alaska, where there's the Inupiaq language was pretty much, aside from my parents muttering in English, that was the language that I was growing up in. And then from there, we went to Ghost Ranch, and I went to school speaking Spanish. I went from Alaska to Abiquiu, New Mexico, going to school with the families of ranchers. And then from there, I grew up, and my first consistent, continuous memories were formed in South Korea, where I was living in the middle of Seoul and watching Seoul recovering still after many decades of war and poverty and various inflicted outcomes from all kinds of different directions. And it wasn't until I was about 10 years old that we moved back to the United States again, and landed in Tucson, Arizona, where once again I was involved in Mexican American communities and very much involved growing up near the border. I was in Tucson, and we were in Mexico constantly as part of my father's work, and working with Native communities in that area of the country. All the time, or throughout that entire time, the Bronx was home. That's where grandma was. Long Island was home. That's where grandpa was. New York City was home. And that was whenever we would go home, we would get on a plane or drive a long way and end up in New York City. That's just a tiny little bit about where I might be coming from in terms of how any of this kind of matters or will matter or continues to matter. The questions of equity are really very interesting to me, and I wonder about the ways that the tools that we're using today bring us into a relationship with new opportunities for equity or not. So with that as an introduction of who I think I am, or who I think I might be, I'll kind of dig right into one of my current project. This is a project that is a community education project, and it's based in San Marcos, which is where the Texas State University is located. I call it Families Learning Together, and I think of it as a computational fluencies project. Describe it just a little bit, and then I'm going to share two of the projects that we're working on currently, or actually not so currently, but two projects that we've been engaged in. So you can see by these pictures that the guts of the project is community involvement with children and families. And I think about computational fluencies as a very broad way of meaningful participation in the world where we are today. So storytelling, citizen science, history telling, and learning together. The underlying basis is the idea of learning together. So in these pictures that you're seeing here, my students are university students. The folks who work with me are university students who are interested in, I don't know why they work with me. In fact, I'm not sure what they're exactly interested in. They come from all over the university, and we pitch it as learning how to teach coding. But once they start working with me, they understand that that really isn't what it's about. It's about learning how to be a community organizer. It's about learning how to work within communities to leverage the empowerment, to leverage the existing knowledge, the indigenous knowledge, if you will, the indigenous knowledge of a community to empower the community with working with contemporary tools, very powerful tools to make art, tell stories, and do science. So these are some of the kids and university students and teachers who have been involved over the last 4 years. And so now I want to talk a little bit. Oh, in fact, wait a second. I skipped over something. I wanted to share with you just very briefly the role of place in, this is the website that I just bounced over to. And I wanted to quickly share this page here because what's very important to me in this project, aside from learning how to work with computers to make meaningful activities, to engage meaningfully in your community, is what's really important to me is the community partners that I work with. And I'm hoping that y'all can see this. Is it too small? Give me a thumbs up, Rena. Should I zoom in on I didn't even think about that. But
it's a little small, Sean.
let me zoom in a little bit here. Is that better?
Yes.
So folks, you can just kind of get a quick look at this. I don't really want to spend too much time on this, but I do want to recognize that the question that Portia raised and also that Raul was speaking to, at least in my mind, is the idea of land and how land matters, how land builds communities, how land is a witness to the way communities traverse, and the way that the land then feeds back into the arrival of the community with whatever kinds of stories that they are bringing with them or transferring through, generating. And so this is an important page, and it really, I think I want to click on this map because I love it. And I found this in the basement of the internet, which is pretty wonderful, a bird's eye view of San Marcos from 1880s. And the university isn't pictured there yet, but you can see the building if you know where to look. But in any case, I will leave it at that and just point to this as something that if anybody is interested in this, I would love to tell you more about the stories of where I'm at with that. And so now I'm going to go back to the presentation and restart it and continue on. So I want to tell you about a couple of projects, but first it's important to recognize, to say just a word about the primary tool, one of the primary tools that we work with. And I want to give you a very brief introduction for those of you that may not be familiar with Scratch. It's a computer programming platform built for children's stories, games, and community explorations. That was developed by the Lifelong Kindergarten group at the MIT Media Lab. I believe it's one of the best tools available to educators and artists on the planet today. It's for community building, for sharing, for learning how to tell stories. And as again, I'm going to bounce back into it now just to show you just one very quick, it's a 1-minute video. This is what the Scratch website platform looks like. And just in case, for those of you that maybe don't know anything about Scratch, I'm in the About Scratch page. And I want to show you this 1 minute, it's 59 seconds. It's a video about the beginning of Scratch. So you snap blocks together, there's sounds, and then you share the project. And then you can then remix. So you share and remix. Okay, so that is a sort of a glitzy promo produced by MIT, which is gives, maybe for those of you that maybe haven't heard of Scratch or aren't sure what it's all about, at least gives you a tiny little peek in behind the curtain here. The main thing for me, and the thing that I emphasize in the work that we're doing, is that Scratch is an ecology. It's a learning ecology. It's a community building ecology where people share, attribute what they're doing to other people, and then remix and tell further stories so that stories emerge from new stories. So now, very briefly then, let me tell you about a project that is kind of wrapped up, or it's sort of on hiatus. For my non-Texas friends, this is welcome a little slice of Central Texas heaven, just not so far from where I sit right here today talking to you. A little town called Martindale. And the if you turn around and you from looking at the river, if you turn around and look back over your shoulder, you'll see the library. And about 4 years ago, three or 4 years ago, my team, my FLT team, and there they are. There's a few of them standing there on the porch of the library. We were invited to form a partnership with the small community in Martindale to run community coding, art and storytelling workshops at the library. And it was the typical kind of thing that we do in San Marcos at the public library or at the elementary schools. But in Martindale, it turned out that the librarian, and this is the librarian, Carol DeVinny there in the corner, she had an ulterior motive, which I wasn't really aware of at the time that we got involved in it. But what she was hoping to do as a librarian was to find a way to get the entire community involved in telling the community's story, creating a biography of the community in a way that wouldn't be locked away in a one single book. And she would hold up these community histories of Central Texas towns. And they were books published 20 years ago, 50 years ago, 75 years ago. And she would say to me, look at how much work, how many memories, how many stories went into this small volume that was then printed maybe 1,000 copies, maybe fewer than 1,000 copies, and it's sitting in the shelves in a box, in a dusty box. We need to tell the story in a way that gets everybody involved. And she said, do you think what you're doing could do that? And I said, well, let's give it a try. So this is an example of this is one of the community meetings. And at the end of the table there, you see one of my university students who was facilitating the meeting, sharing of stories and sharing of ideas around what would it mean and what would we do to bring the living community history into scratch. So what resources would we need to dig out of people's dusty back rooms and scan the photographs? What stories would we tell? One of the stories that surfaced, which was made everybody laugh, and it still kind of makes me laugh as well, is that 50 years ago there was a farmer, a rancher, who would drive into town in a beat up old Ford by the time he was in his 70s, and then in his 80s, and then in his 90s. Long after he had lost his eyesight, he would drive into town, and he knew the way so well that he was able to get from his farmhouse into town, down the road next to the general store. And they, instead of asking him to stop driving because he was legally blind, they just got out of his way and they lined the road and said, turn a little to the left. Okay, keep going straight. Nope, wait, you're going too far. You're going too far to the left. What a great story. What an interesting story as well. Obviously, we know that we don't have to look too far to understand that within the stories of small towns built on ranching, built on farming, built on the division of labor, that there's a very, very strong likelihood that the equity around ownership, the equity around empowerment is not going to look like we might like it to look. What Carol DeVinny wanted us to realize was that the survival of this town required that the families from the cotton mills and the gin mills and the farm workers and the landowners and the transient educators or professionals that were coming and going, that the town, in order for it to survive, it had to reinvent itself in a way that was equitable to everybody who had ever played a part in it. Really idealistic, amazing idea. So from that emerged a number of things, but one of the things that emerged from this was the story of the project itself. These are some of the young women, also students with FLT, that created a project around telling the story of the project, the living community history. And this was at a poster that they presented and talked about at MIT during the Scratch conference a couple of years ago. And the notion that they were so invested in their own learning that they were taking time out from their studies. And students at Texas State University, maybe it needs to be mentioned for those of you that may not be familiar with it. It's known as a Hispanic serving institution. More than 50% of our students are first generation college students. A vast majority of them are working in outside of their own homes, outside of their own academics to make it possible to go to school. They're very busy, very industrious, very hardworking young people. And when I asked them, when I approached them, or they approached me about joining FLT, I had just scratched my head. Of course, please join. But why? Oh my gosh, we are so busy already. You've got so much going on. In any case, and to Portia's point earlier, in the lower left-hand corner of the poster there, you'll see that there was barbecue. The town introduced welcomed the FLT to the town of Martindale by throwing a big barbecue feast where everybody came out and started talking about how great it was to be there. A lot of time was spent in just getting to know you, doing workshops with coding and doing workshops with basic digital technologies to help people get to know each other. Very much when Raul, when you mentioned about the lino cuts, that's a lot of what we were doing, is getting to know each other. I'm sad to say that this project never actually resulted in a working living community history on Scratch. The way that funding gets done and the way that students come and go and the way that my own workload kind of shifts from semester to semester, it made it really, really difficult. And in fact, the barrier to completion, or the barrier to getting a working prototype up on the Scratch community, turned out to be too steep, too difficult. And so as an idea, I think it's extraordinarily valuable. And in the hearts of the young people who worked with me, and in the hearts of the community members who worked with us, I hope that the idea is very strong, and maybe it's a distant memory or it's a fading memory, but I do hope that we will have the infrastructure to return to a community project like this. So let me tell you about another project. This project is much newer. This is since the pandemic began. And when everything shut down in San Marcos, I decided that I didn't want to stop all of our library clubs and all of our after school clubs, and we needed to keep something going. So I said, you know, what the heck, let's try it, Scratch Game Team. And I pitched it to a number of principals of the elementary schools and to community leaders around San Marcos as, this is going to be really a team. This is not just an after school club. This is, we need parents to sign up and be really committed to the idea that when they sign up, their children are going to meet with us, of course, by Zoom. So this is the typical, this was one of the sessions. We had about 15 children in the end who joined us and signed up, plus 2 university students who you see there as well, university students from their own home studios, their own home bedrooms. Working with the children to learn how to design games, and designing games in Scratch. The process here was remarkably successful. I found it to be just incredibly amazing. So I'm gonna bounce into what are known as studios inside Scratch. So I'm gonna zoom in again. Tell me, Rena, if folks you think you can see the thumbnails there, at least see them a little bit. This is what we call, this was our clubhouse. We thought of this as our clubhouse. So when the children were, the gamers, the teammates were in the 5th grade, and so rising into the 6th grade, because this was during the summer. So the students, the gamers, when they made a project, they would post it in the studio here. And then we would use the comment tab to leave comments for each other, to share ideas about how to make the game better, how to make the design more fun. One of the impetuses of the game design, there's certainly an aspect of learning how to use the tool, learning how to manipulate the images to create your own images. But in addition to that, the idea was, how do we make the game relevant to our community? And what is your community? Where do you think you are you feel at home? What kinds of stories do you want to tell? And that notion was, I think it went over pretty well. I'll show you one or two here, just very briefly here. So you get a sense of the kind of things. So this is called Pop the Balloon. And I'm not sure what the community is in this case, but this is the instructions. Click the balloon to get points. If you get to 10 points, then you get a donut. Well, there you go. 5th graders love donuts, and they also want to make balloons pop. So I guess it totally makes sense. Here's the community aspect here. I used the tutorial, and thanks for the help to Scratch Game Team. I'm going to show you what it looks like. I'm going to go to full screen here. I'm going to press the green flag, and the balloon starts moving. And now I have to concentrate because it's going very fast. There we go. I got 10, and here's my prize. I get a donut. what we would say then, what we would do when we would share that, when we'd share that game, and um, the idea would be, so what can we do to make the game harder or slower or faster, or how do we improve the game play? So there was a lot of talk about what does it mean to play a game? What kind of systems have to be in place in order for us to enjoy a game? What do we have to know going into the game? What do we learn while we're playing the game? And the conversations that the fifth and sixth graders had were really rich and really kind of expansive. They kept expanding and expanding. This is an example here called the Lost Wand, and this is a maze game. We did kind of type in. We kind of asked the children. We gave them genres of games. What kinds of games do you play? What kinds of games are valuable to you? So I'm going to press the green flag, and now the year 2020. So this fifth grader put in a timer. I'm using my arrow keys, and watch what happens if I hit the wall. Bang! I go back to the beginning. There's a lot of tropes in here. There's a lot of ideas that are remixed in game design from all over the place. So I'm using my up arrow key, and now I have to navigate this very small opening, my down arrow key, then I have to navigate this opening, and my down arrow key, now scrolling across. Now there's the wand. Now watch what happens when I intersect with the wand. Bang, the end. So I love this, and I love it because I've been so involved in storytelling. When I taught writing, when I did journalism, when I did as a commercial photographer, when I told stories for advertisers, and showing children that they can engage in making a game. This kid, I'm not going to play this one because I'll lose miserably. This may be one of the hardest maze games that you have ever played. In the game, you are the hen who lost her baby in a maze. So this is the idea of integrating something about stories that are meaningful in the community. This is creating a narrative element that drives the game. So like any other parent would, you would go chase after them, but there is also a hungry fox that wants to eat your child. Beat the fox before it's too late. Oh, and you cannot touch the black lines. She was very, thank you to me for creating this epic maze, and don't rage quit. So you see that there's the fox and the hen is right. Watch. So here she sets up the story, and now you have to go and save him. And the fox is thinking, I'm very hungry right now, and is going to start chasing the hen. It's going to be bad news. This was a lot of fun to see her kind of work through the ideas. And when she presented the prototype to us, and we all talked about it, and we shared ways of making it more fun, and the other children left definitely a rage quit. It was very, very difficult to win that game. Okay, so that's a little bit of that as an idea here. One of the children, when we were the game, we had our scratch meetings every week on Wednesdays, and sometimes the children, the question of equity around devices and equity around internet usage is very important, of course, to many different ways, many different aspects of what we're doing as educators and as artists. And the way that we navigate those difficulties around access to get participation, to help children really understand the value of participating in a way that's meaningfully connected to who they are, what their ideas are, what their hopes are. My work these days, and this is relatively new work for me. I closed down my commercial photo studio in New York in 2009. And I had been teaching at NYU and at Parsons and at other the College of Staten Island and community colleges. I'd been teaching one course a semester for many years while I was doing commercial photography, because on a commercial photography set, some of you may know this, but for others it will come as no surprise, there's not a whole lot of scintillating conversation about art or communities or about pretty much anything else on a commercial photography set. Mostly you're worried about where the lights are and if the model's on time and did the hair and makeup person get things set up right, and does the art director like what's happening? And if the art director doesn't like what's happening, can we get her some coffee? Can we get some cookies for everybody? Can we figure out how to change it? There's a lot of that stuff going on in a commercial photography set, which really didn't float my boat very much. Really, I liked the work. I loved my teammates. But I was teaching in colleges, teaching photography, teaching digital art, teaching writing, teaching storytelling, just to keep my own creative soul alive. But in 2009, I decided I had enough, and I quit and closed up the studio and went back to school and did a doctorate in education and in art education, and decided I was going to take this part of my life and try to do something that felt a little more meaningfully connected to what I believed in and what I really wanted to do. I don't regret being a commercial photographer for 25 years, not at all. So that's not the spirit in which I'm saying that. However, I am very much engaged today in thinking about how to bring a sense of creative and meaningful tool engagement to elementary school teachers, to communities that might not have access to these tools in a way that fosters interdependence. So it's not a case of going to work for IBM or something like IBM. You imagine going to work for Apple or going to work for Spotify. That's not the outcome that I'm looking for. I'm looking for a process of engagement. I'm looking for a way of thinking about the potential of making meaning. And so in the Scratch Game Club, one of the reasons why I think it's so successful is that these kids showed up every week, and their parents made sure they showed up every week, and they would move things around so the kids could be there every week, and the kids engaged. They shared with each other, they shared with us. Their ideas changed as they went by. One day, one of the kids wasn't on Zoom, and we were, I hope the kid's okay. I hope he's all right. And then all of a sudden he, ding donged in as happens on Zoom. And we said, well, what's going on? Are you all right? And clearly the kid was not in a great place. He was in the back of a car, and we're so glad you're with us. Are you going to be able to join us? He said, I've got my mom's personal cell phone, so I'll be able to join. And so that's fantastic. And, they wanted him to be there. And as we were talking about the games, and we could see he was in the back seat of a car, so he had a laptop on his lap, I suppose. And after a while, it started to not look so good. He started to look like he was having trouble. And one of my college students said, "Are you okay? Is everything all right? Do you need anything?" And he finally said, "No, everything's fine. Everything's fine." And then again and again, and finally said, Dr. Justice, I don't feel so good. I don't feel so good." I said, "Oh gosh, he's gotten car sick. He's in the back of the car. His mom's driving back and forth, and he's looking at a laptop, and he's trying to talk to us about how to program his game. He said, I don't feel so good. I don't feel so good." And then kind of a lurch, and the screen went black, and we think, "Oh, poor kid. I hope he didn't ruin the laptop." We kind of laughed at it. We laughed about it. He came back the next week. We laughed about it then. I hope I'm pointing to here, I hope that what I'm leaning towards trying to suggest is that this organization, this community education group that I'm involved in, it's very new work for me, but it makes me feel really connected. And it's sort of hard to put it into words, because a lot of times with my colleagues, it looks very trivial. So you're an artist. And in fact, what you're seeing behind me now is some of the work that I do with computation. This is a series of line drawings that I'm making using Scratch. I work with Scratch to make these line drawings. And it's an evolving set of generative drawings. And right now it's very exploratory. But when my colleagues see things like this, they at least can imagine something around the art world, what that means or how that works to their expectations, in their expectations. But when they hear me talk about families learning together and computational fluencies and children designing games and communities making living histories, they're perplexed. They don't know what it is. My colleagues in the computer science, in the computer science department, they don't want to know anything about me because I'm an artist. And my colleagues in the art school, they have a hard time dealing with me because I look like a computer scientist. So I'm very much in, again, in between, like, where is that home? What is the potential for community, of meaningful community building? But I find this work incredibly powerful, creating a new landscape. And I'm gonna kind of leave it here because as I thought I might do, I got wrapped up in the storytelling and the second half of the presentation, where I wanted to talk a little bit more in depth about how I see tool use playing into meaning making, and how I see the internet, the age of the internet, potentially opening opportunities for equity, for new ways of thinking about equity. These are really incredible, incredibly important issues for me, and incredibly important ideas for me. I think, and I hope, I guess, but I think that what I'm doing with FLT and with community education, I think I'm exploring these ideas in a way that can become part of a community property, part of a community ownership, part of a spreading sort of concentric circles or ripples on a pond. But I don't know. But it could be a complete waste of time. And that's the part. Raul, I'll take a drink of water for a second. Your passion around the telling stories and around the community engagement, I feel like there's a very important kind of consistency in that story that you were telling with the story that I'm trying to tell. In a way, I wish I had started this journey 25 years ago, but without understanding how to build teams and how to think about community sharing and how to think about sophisticated tools being used for general purposes, for unsophisticated purposes. These are the things I learned as a commercial photographer: how to tell stories and images, how to get people together, how to get teams together, how to navigate disagreements, how to really work through very deep fighting, shouting matches where there's, on a commercial photography set, there's a lot of money at stake. There's a lot of egos at stake. How do you deal with that kind of environment, with that kind of acrimonious community, and still get the job done? So that's kind of the land I think I'm trying to find. I feel really hopeful about it, but it doesn't quite look like what maybe other artists are doing in some way. And so I do fight with that Portia said, like, where is the home? And I really don't know. But so I'll leave it there. And hopefully there's something about this, the work that I'm doing that you're interested in, that maybe sparks some questions, or potentially makes you connect with ideas, with your own ideas, because around technologies, around the internet, because this is something that we're all dealing with I mean, I'm sure as I don't need to tell any of us that we really do have a tremendous amount of investment in, and trying to figure out how to engage our communities in a way that can become equitable. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing and I will turn it back over to Rena and to Dawn. Thank you very much again. Thank you so much for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Sean. Dawn, are you ready?
Sure. Hello.
Hi.
So I am actually a native Texan, and I happen to live in the town that Dr. Justice was just talking about. So I teach at UT Austin, and I live in San Marcos, Texas. And I have traveled all around Texas, and I hardly leave. So what I want to talk tonight about is sort of my involvement in classrooms and how that shifted to involvement in community, and how that has shifted into sanctioned city involvement, and where I'm literally now on the San Marcos Arts Commission, and it's a whole different perspective. So I am going to screen share and try to let you see some images that all the images that are behind me and going through my mind right now when I'm trying to speak, it'll help me tell the story. So one of the things I wanted to start out with, so that I wouldn't interrupt the flow of the talk with technology, is I'm going to be talking about the Houston Art Car Parade and how being involved in that community kind of changed my life and was sort of that transition from classroom to city art participant. So also my sound's gonna, I think the music is really loud on this, but you have to have the volume up in order to hear the people. So here is a little bit about the Houston Art Car Parade that I will be talking about shortly.
What do you expect this will be like?
Well, some kind of transformed automobiles.
What is your favorite part of the art car parade?
Couldn't be the cars.
I think the best thing about it is all the people who come together for it. It's just the best thing in the world. You can't not sit there without a smile on your face. Is this your first art car parade?
Oh, just don't put this car full.
I have to admit, it's my first art car parade.
And how long have you lived in Houston?
Only about 4 years, but I still feel like I'm behind.
This is the first time I've ever been here. I've lived here for 10 years. It's the first time I've come down.
How long have you been doing the art car parade?
This is my 25th year. Back then, you just showed up and signed a waiver, got a number, and had fun.
This year 26, I guess it's either 26 because I like working together as a group. I like troubleshooting. I like the conversations that go on. It gives me goosebumps.
What made you start making art car?
I really wanted to just be part of it more than just a spectator. I wanted to be a participant. I go, hey, I can do that.
Do you think you're going to make an art car one day?
Yes, ma'am. Like that one, the building one, but I'm gonna have buildings on the side.
So when can we expect this car?
I'm gonna have to say that by the next parade.
Do you have like a schedule of how you're going to roll down the parade? We're going to freestyle it.
Last year's car was covered in beer bottle caps. So the question was, did you drink all that?
And did you?
And that was the title of the car, was yes, I drank all. It took me 10 years to get it all, but yeah.
10 years. So you started drinking way before you guys started thinking about our car.
Right.
How many more years do you think you're going to do this?
I'm not dead. Mrs. Jones, we're going to keep doing
Mrs.
it.
Jones,
Okay, we'll keep doing it.
There you go. All right. What is it? Put a little chill in everything you do?
Exactly.
Put a little art car in everything you do. I like that. I like that.
Too. Okay, here's my 5 to that.
High five.
So that is kind of how I transitioned in from the classroom into the community and being involved in the city. And one of the things that I like to talk about is how something like Art Car is something that can make a big city like Houston feel like a small town. If you're involved and you're sort of doing it right, you have all these connections, you meet people you wouldn't have otherwise met. And so I guess I should talk a little bit more about that. Art Cars kind of started about 1986. It started as a renegade sort of art movement where some people involved in different things in Houston, like the University of Houston, Art Lawndale, and a group called the Urban Animals that were skaters downtown Houston. All these people that were involved in, and the Orange Show, all these people that were involved in these different organizations got together. There was a Houston International Festival. It was a really big deal. And there were about 6 to 15 cars that just got decorated and drove around the city of Houston during this event. And they kept getting together and doing it. They eventually got invited to be part of Houston International Festival. Then that got big, and then they split off and it became its own parade. And so there have been, last year would have been the 32nd parade. They did have a virtual parade, but so basically it's an event that's been going on for 30 years and anybody can participate. So you just have to submit your entry and pay the entry fee, and basically you're in. That's how it's been so far. It's not juried, it's not curated. It's, you usually are organized by who just applies and what order they apply in. And so you'll have people that are like famous artists, like the art guys or Mel Chin, who participate. Dion Lauren has participated. Dion Laurent has participated. And then you also have, so out of about 300 entries, 200 to 300 entries, about 40 to 60 will actually be youth entries. So sometimes they're schools, sometimes they're community organizations, sometimes there's churches. So it's just a wide range of people that are coming together to participate in this thing. And somehow it has evolved to where 200 to 300,000 people will come out every year to see these art cars roll by. So people get to interact with the artist and look at cars before lineup. But that's kind of the basics of the art car parade that kind of changed my life. So I'm going to go back into screen share, and I wish I could ask you questions now. If you want to throw a question in the chat, I will try to catch it. So screen share, desktop. Hopefully I have the right PowerPoint up. Okay. Slideshow. View show. Whoops. Let me do it. Move out of the way. I can do it. Okay. So when I started preparing for this talk and thinking about Uprooted and how I got involved in grassroots organizing and how I ended up getting involved in being involved in the Arts Commission, is kind of like, I really couldn't quite figure out how to piece the story together, but really it kind of takes place in 3 sections, where on the left, I have my life as an art educator. And in that life, I was always interested in how I could bring students outside the school on things like field trips, and then how I could get things from inside the school to outside in the community. So there are several projects there where that happened. So while I was getting my master's, or I guess at the end of when I was getting my master's, I formed a nonprofit group. And that group, one of the things we did was create a community art cart, which is the one on the top. And that influenced back over on my school side, where we brought an artist in the middle picture, in the left column. I don't know if y'all can see my cursor, but we brought in artists with my nonprofit. We were able to, that nonprofit was created to bridge the gap between artists and art educators in Houston. And there were multiple things that we did, but one of the things that was kind of cool was bringing in a local artist to talk to my students, and she's there talking to them about their projects. So later, when I went on to get my doctorate, I got to do my PhD on the art car community. And this is a vehicle where I did research based on why people come to the art car parade, why people participate. And literally it was about creating an art car where people could share their thoughts with me. And there were multiple facets to that study. And then most recently, this is the car that I drive every day now, and I'll get into that more later. And then over here on the right is sort of my city life. And so this is where I've gone from doing things in the classroom to bringing what I learned how to do in the classroom into the community. So these are all city sponsored events or artworks. And this is the public art. They're starting kind of a sculpture garden outside of our library here in San Marcos. So, and I'm going to go into that a little bit more. So again, I would say that really the art car, my involvement in that community, that involvement really kind of is a thread through my entire career. So again, that took me from being in the classroom to participating in the community to now participating in in the Arts Commission and at other city activities. And I was thinking about all of these as different forms of public art, going to see public art, what we consider public art, being the face of a city, how a renegade art car became something celebrated by the city of Houston. You'll see banners and advertisements about how Houston is art car capital of the world. And then some of the things that I thought about in relationship to public art are things like belonging and how you can be belonging in a group but still feel displaced. And then how ultimately participating and being displaced can lead to transformation. So that's where I'm going with the ideas that I'm talking about now. So to go back to my life as a classroom educator. So I wanted to get more specific about some of the things that have shaped who I am and how I understand community and understand working with a city and learning from a city. So when I was a Montessori teacher, literally 20 plus years ago, we were able to go on field trips a lot. So this in the upper left corner was it was a public art scavenger hunt that we did. I was able to go on a lot of field trips with the students, and they were usually related to what we were learning. I taught general classes. So if we were learning about biology, we might go to a natural science exhibition, or when we were learning about the history of writing, we went to the history of, the Houston Printmaking Museum. So I was able to really utilize a lot of the resources that the city had to offer. And I think taking the kids to these places really made me comfortable going to those places as an individual. They really kind of, like, I never felt out of place because I'd been many times with children. So then I already talked about the one in the center top, where the nonprofit that I formed while I was getting my master's and working at Montessori school. This is where we were working to bridge the gap between art educators and artists in the city of Houston. And one of the great things we did was artist in residencies, where we had local artists. We had them do mini residencies. So we coordinated like 8 residencies or 6 to 8 residencies during a year. And so different artists would go out to different campuses and they would work with the teachers. They would be able to, so like if a teacher was teaching about ceramics and didn't really know a whole lot about ceramics, a visiting artist could come and do a mini residency and maybe show the students a technique, printmaking, something like that, whatever the teacher needed. It was not a pre-planned artist in residency. It was responsive to the needs of both the art teacher and the educator. So then later, after I did my dissertation, I went back to the classroom. And another thing, I worked at a middle school in Houston that Houston is, again, it's a port city. It's also a very international city. There's as many as 93 languages spoken in Houston. So it's not surprising that in one art classroom, I had as many as 7 languages. So we had a very international population. We had a large refugee population. And we had many students that had not been to school before, literally some that their first day of school was in the US. So I have a lot of stories about that, but I want to focus on the public art and the community dynamic. Houston has this thing called Spark Parks, and it was based on they did a survey about what people wanted in Houston. And one of the things that people responded that they wanted was more places it wasn't quite green space, but recreational space. And so the people that were involved in that research thought, hey, public schools are publicly owned space. Why don't we work with public schools and have an art component? So it's Spark Parks. And what they would do is they would kind of create a welcoming space to the public. And if there was an artist on the campus, if there was an art teacher on the campus, then the art teacher would collaborate and do a project. So mine was this compass in the lower left. There's a whole range of, like, if you look up Houston Spark Parks, you can see they have a great website, and they've been doing this program at least a decade. If there's not an art teacher on campus, an artist will be commissioned to work with the campus. And often there is a student involvement, student participation component. And they have a great little ribbon cutting thing. There's actually now Spark Park Week. So city officials came out for our ribbon cutting. This was also involved the University of Houston Architecture Department. They were like lead architects. They did research with their grad students and kind of recognized at our school, transportation was a big issue, and that a lot of students rode buses, that the bus stop came there, and they really felt like that's where our community and the school intersected, was because of the buses. And so they created this, it was supposed to be solar, you were supposed to be able to, it was supposed to have solar panels. And it was supposed to be really green. You were supposed to be able to charge your cell phone there. And then at night, it was also supposed to light up. Some of those things didn't happen, but we did get a great bus stop. And then the artwork that corresponded with that was a compass, and the artwork on the compass kind of brought again what happened inside the school to the outside. And so that transition space, some of the tiles that students made were things referring to technology, things referring to personification. One of them drew a locker, because it's so associated with high school, we still had lockers at that campus. So just referring to things that they were studying, geography. It was a STEM school, so there were some things that referred to the STEM program and just general learning. So all of my classes helped work together to create this little compass rose. And then one of my most favorite projects of my entire teaching career is this project on the right, which is about endangered species of Texas. And when I started this project, I was looking for something. Prayer flags were popular, and I was looking for something very sustainable. And I was looking for something for this thing called Big Art Day, which is where it's an art advocacy strategy. It's a day where Texas wants to encourage art educators to do something to promote and advocate for the arts. So I thought it would be great to hang these prayer flags that were both a sustainable project, but also a teaching project. and something that again brought what the students were doing outside of the classroom, outside into the larger world. And then so the ones on the top are they're drawing on the drawing racks. They were actually one of the things that surprised me when I was learning about endangered species of Texas was that there are literally, I didn't have to have any students repeat an animal. There's plants and animals, so it's living things, endangered species. So I ended up having like one class do reptiles, one class do fish, one class did mammals, and there were enough endangered species for every student to not even cover all of the animals that are endangered or at risk. And so then the follow-up to that was because printmaking, you can make multiples. We were trying to figure out how to make like a family day event, and that became what we did at 72 degrees. Originally, I thought about doing printmaking, and then I was like, uh-oh, people can't walk off with wet flags, and we don't want to just create flags that are going to get left behind. And so I ended up teaching, we brought students made multiple flags. So they kept one, we made one for the installation, and then we had 3 that we used for the community project. And so people could come and they could sew, they could pick the endangered species. So it contributed to people in the community learning both about endangered species of Texas, but also people were often surprised at what we were learning in the art classroom. They were kind of like, oh, wow, that's really a lot to think about. So, so that was a great project. And that's kind of where my classroom life that began with how do I get the students out into the world? How do I get their art out into the world? But then how do I bring the world to my students? How do those boundaries lie? How do I transcend those boundaries? So on a related issue, so with the art cars, originally, so the top row is a Jeep that I bought specifically for the purpose of making collaborative art cars, and it sure did come in handy. The first one we made with my nonprofit, I already mentioned. The second one in the middle here was for my dissertation, and then the third one was actually San Marcos High School. And that teacher had a public art class. She had an advanced painting class, which she always did a public art component for. So again, she had kind of she has a very similar approach to art education where she wants to get what the students do out into the community. Students are part, the families are part of the community. Then we go when everything we do is kind of behind the school walls, particularly now that you have to have an ID to enter the campus. Campuses security has become much tighter, so I think there's a lot more separation between what goes on campus and what goes on outside of campus. Other than football games, there's not a lot of overlap. So the interesting thing is when I did the ones on the top, and there were probably 2 or 3 more with the Jeep, but its only purpose was to be an art car. And when I did those, I definitely considered myself an insider to the tradition. I'd been involved with creating the Art Car Ball for several years, which is a party that happened on Art Car Weekend. And anybody from the city of Houston can come to the Art Car Ball, and it's considered one of the wildest parties of the year. And people, it's kind of costumes preferred. So even attendees are encouraged to dress up and have fun and be part of the community. So I definitely considered myself an insider to the tradition. I had cars, I had temporary art cars, but in some ways I felt like an outsider to the tradition because I hadn't ever made a full commitment to having what's known as a daily driver. And I really just didn't think I wanted the attention and didn't know if I could really commit to having a daily driver, to always having to be in this car and always have to be performing. But ultimately, my truck that's in the lower sections got 300,000 miles. The roof was a little rusty. And I finally was like, this car has no resale value. It has no value to anyone but me. And it's rusty on top. And you can't tell me that me painting it is going to somehow ruin the value of a rusty top car. So I finally just went for it. I'd actually said before that I was going to turn it into a art car the third time it got hit. And it actually got hit more than 3 times, hence that big bumper. Literally the month the paper tags came off, it got rear-ended. It was definitely a magnet for getting hit. But I always tried to keep it, you know, factory models, factory speculations, because it felt like violating those norms just felt wrong. When you take sandpaper to a perfectly good paint job, it feels wrong. So I had to wait until my roof got rusty. So the interesting thing now is that I don't live in Houston. There aren't other art cars driving around town. So it's kind of it's not an oddity, but it is a little bit different. It definitely gets noticed. I did try to create something that was a little subtle. But it's funny that I am now, I guess I could be considered more legitimate as an art car artist, because I have a daily driver. And also this is the first one that I solely created on my own. There's no collaboration with this one whatsoever. It's all mine. But again, I'm living in a different city. I can go back and be in the parade. And I have gone back a couple years and been in the parade with this vehicle, but I still have to use it for my daily life. So here I am with this decorated car doing mundane things like taking things to the green guy to get them recycled, or taking things to brush drop off as we do yard work. And then really my favorite thing about this car is that I have a signal on top that no matter where I am, Prince can find me. So in terms of dislocation and uprootedness, the one thing I know is that no matter where I am, when it's time for me to go to the after party and join Prince for the after party, he can find me. The signal's on top of the car. So lastly, I've gotten into the role of the arts and art education with the city. So again, this is, well, I'll start with the upper left, which is a community program that the city got a grant for, where students who are working with, they're part of what this youth service bureau, and I don't know exactly the criteria for who all goes to those camps, but they do qualify for social services, or the families qualify for social services. And so these students were brought from where the youth service bureau once a week to have art lessons at this newly formed place called, this is Cephas House, and it's in Eddie Durham Park. And these are in Dunbar. It's Dunbar neighborhood in San Marcos, which is actually where I live. So it was very cool to have students brought to me, basically, to what I consider my neighborhood. This was a brand new park formed at the time. They had just opened it that probably spring, and the program was during the summer. So another thing I did, this was again before I actually got involved in the Arts Commission. The art teacher that I mentioned earlier that had the public art class, or she had a painting class, advanced painting class that she considered a public art class. She and another teacher got a grant to create, they won the commission for the mural on the side of a building. This is a building on the historic square. It's right across from the courthouse. And basically they created this mural that told the story of the passage of time. So how people came to town. So back here at the back, there were like people coming to town on horses, and then it showed the different decades. So like in about where the ladder is, there were people like representing the 70s, and then closest to the front were people using cell phones. And so the student, this student just happened to be playing Pokemon Go and stopped by with her phone. There were 2 or 3 students that came by and they were just literally out playing Pokemon Go, and they asked, "What are you doing?" And so then they became part of, so these community members actually became part of the mural. So that was pretty fascinating. And that happened probably the summer before I actually got on the Arts Commission. And then here's another community project I did with Keep San Marcos Beautiful. They have a music concert series every Thursday in the summer, or Wednesday. Sometimes it's Wednesdays, sometimes it's Thursday. For like 7 weeks in the summer, I want to say probably 7 weeks in the summer. So one year I was invited to do community art projects again, which I love. Dr. Justice talked about families learning together. And so that is absolutely one of my favorite things about being in the community, is that you have adults and children working together side by side, and they're really engaged. And that really is one of my favorite things to do. And then down here at the bottom is, again, I think I mentioned we have an emerging sculpture garden. And so on the Arts Commission now, we're talking about what we want to do in terms of building the public art collection and what that will look like and where we want to do it in the town. So it's pretty fun to be involved in. But at the same time, being involved with things like the city Arts Commission and the Mural Arts Commission and everything that's going on in the world, I felt like a lot of, I do feel like my community involvement is definitely rooted at in the classroom. So, but it feels like if I turn this over sideways, I definitely feel firmly rooted in art education. And I definitely, feel like art cars are a solid part, that middle part that goes all the way through all the, if you were to consider this like a tree, right? The roots would be art education, and that middle trunk would be art cars and community art. And then getting into now the Arts Commission, sort of thinking about that as leaves on trees, and or maybe in being involved with that as sort of me looking at the world differently, and or art differently, or public differently, and kind of being at a point where I'm seeing how things shake out. So on the Arts Commission, we do, one of the main things that people talk about is beautification. And so I'm always thinking, I love aesthetics, so I'm always thinking about, does art have to be beautiful? And then I also have been thinking more in terms of, is stuff like this a use or abuse of art? So on the lower 2 panels, one of the things we're working on now, so on the lower right, there are 2, they're bridges, and they're paintings, and they are intended to encourage people to not litter. They are also graffiti abatement. And so sometimes I've found myself really questioning, as a person who really loves outsider art and loves renegade things, to want to abate graffiti is something that I question myself. And to create something that's so-called beautiful, but also is didactic, these are things that really are making me rethink how I'm thinking about art. So this is another project. It was a mobility hub, and we were trying to decide what they did, what an art installation. But these are kind of some of the things that we think about. What art would go well here? What do we want in the collection? What represents the town? Another thing that I've seen as problematic is that people want some of these things like interactive. Often when a mural request goes out, it will ask for an interactive component and they will ask for a community component. And I think these things are great, but they also raise issues. The murals that are created, specifically murals, sorry, I think some of the, I just got distracted and now there's a dog whining at the door. So sorry, the murals, some of the art projects are paid for out of hot funds. We have a public art fund, permanent art collection fund, and then we have funding that comes from hot taxes, and we can give grants to organizations, but really the grants that go to organizations, we want that money comes from hot tax. So really that's about getting heads into beds. And so it kind of becomes this convoluted thing where I love it because it gives artists a chance to create something. It supports artists, it supports local artists, but artists are allowed to submit applications from anywhere. So we've had many that came from outside of Texas. I haven't done a total analysis of how many are local versus how many are out of state yet. But these are all things that begin to get questioned. And so this is one of the points where I'm kind of a little troubled at. The more I work with it, the more I have to rethink it. And it just has me rethinking what I know and understand about what public art means. At the University of Texas, in 2017, where I work, so I work at the University of Texas, and I think I've been thinking a lot about the environment, literally the campus environment and the classroom environment, particularly in terms of what happened in the spring and summer of 2020 with the deaths of Breonna Taylor, Black Lives Matter, and things that have been going on. They've been going on for a while. So in 2017, in the upper right hand side, in 2017, UT did remove Confederate statues after the uprisings in, I believe, Charlottesville. There were 3 statues that were removed very quietly, and they still sit like this. They're just wrapped and the pedestals are just abandoned, which is fine. But it is kind of a strange sight and a reminder. And again, there's lots of going back and forth about what should be there, how, and even before this summer, before this spring, there had been efforts to be more inclusive. There are sculptures on campus, including Dr. Martin Luther King, Barbara Jordan, one of the first Black students that was admitted into the UT Law School is in front of the library. So it's a space of transition. I'm not sure, in the lower right, there's a racial geography tour created by one of the professors at UT that talks about racism that's been basically the institution's history tied up with racism and how those markers are still left. And this summer, there was a big outcry by the students as well. They made a list of demands and they wanted a certain number of things renamed, like housing halls, football stadiums, multiple things on campus that have been highlighted, uncovered through the racial geography tour. But again, this summer, kind of are coming to a head. And then even in our own department, so I'm currently on an anti-racism task force, and I've been thinking about things like white walling in institutions and both the physical environment, aesthetic expectations, what people refer to as modern aesthetics, and how those are exclusive and create exclusive and create an environment that privileges one visual method over many other options. So those are some things I'm thinking about in terms of the physical and the learning and emotional environment. And then again, related to the students, in the list, there were 3 different student student drafted demands of the organization of UT that went around the summer. And one of the things on that list was also about doing the land acknowledgement. And so questions of ownership have really come up for me recently related to land acknowledgements, just doing and committing to land acknowledgement. I am coming from the Coahuiltecan, the lands of the Coahuiltecans. And when I first did the land acknowledgement, I have to say that I felt really embarrassed because in the town where I live, San Marcos, there's a Coahuiltecan Hall. Every year there's a Sacred Springs powwow, and every time there's an event, this is kind of the lower left picture next to the cave painting, or not a cave painting, but the graphic on the wall. We have water blessing ceremonies and Coahuiltecans. That's Dr. Garza, I believe, and the Coahuiltecan people are very much of our community fabric. So, and I don't know if I mentioned the Coahuiltecan Hall, like in the neighborhood next to mine is a place called the Coahuiltecan Hall. Often things from this Sacred Springs powwow events will be held there. And I have friends who've always been able to say it, but until the first time I made it a point to say it, I didn't realize that I couldn't say it. And so I felt embarrassed that I hadn't taken the time to get to learn more about the indigenous history of the area where I live. Like, I understand it, I know it. I know that this is a place called, like, that it's considered the sacred river. And it's kind of a sacred river to everyone, and not everyone in this town, but most of the locals. And then one of the things that I ended up popping up was that the Coahuiltecan people had asked both the University of Texas and Texas State University to return remains of indigenous remains that, from what I understand, had been unburied by TxDOT. I don't know a whole lot of history about that, but what did happen was that Texas State agreed to return the remains, and initially UT did not. So, and I think I might have skipped part of the story, but both UT and Texas State had remains that came from TxDOT, and I did cover that Texas State yet said yes, and they were going to return the remains, which is actually this top picture. They were reinterred in here in San Marcos. So the people there, some of the argument was about whether or not they could prove that the time that these remains lived were the same time. Some archaeologists had disagreed about whether or not these were actually Coahuiltecan, because of the time frame of the, I guess, presumption of when the bodies had actually been living. So that became really interesting, because literally when I started trying to learn how to pronounce Coahuiltecan and sometimes people will say Coahuiltecan, so there's a little bit of variance in it, but it really taught me a lot, because I had, again, no idea not only how to say it, but I knew about repatriating objects because I taught artifacts, because I taught that in conjunction with ceramics. But this was totally foreign to me, kind of unbelievable to me that bodies had been stored in boxes at universities. So the UT students did a teach-in and appeal to the new university president, and eventually the remains are going to be returned. One of the things that I found out about San Marcos is that they agreed to let the Coahuiltecan people have the first place in Texas, the first cemetery in Texas for the repatriation of remains. Excuse me. And so it's just very much part of our culture. And we just thinking about who owns, colonial ideas of ownership of a place versus being, owning a place versus being a caretaker and caring for, being in possession of a former person, a person's body, versus wanting to be a caretaker to help them move on to the next phase, into their spiritual journey, are all very different ways of thinking about the land and ownership. So, sorry, I don't usually talk this much. And I definitely ask a lot of questions. So this again is a nearby creation story that talks about how the people emerged from the sacred springs. So this is another thing I learned about was rock art in Texas. So art education definitely keeps me learning all the time. The places that I live, the names of the places that I live, the streets I travel on, usually tell a story that's just waiting for me to stop, to rethink, to re-examine and re-examine everything. So that is my story. I hope you have questions for all of us on the panel. Thanks for staying with us all of this time or for joining us for part of the time. If you would like to talk to me about more about any of these things, I am at the University of Texas, and my email is dsteinecker@Austin, UTexas. I need to go fix my own typo there. UTexas, there's an A in there, .edu. And also, if you type my name, it's IE, not EI. If you know German, sometimes people get those mixed up. So thank you for listening and watching, and I look forward to questions that come up next.
Thanks, Dawn. So Andres Peralta is going to conclude and negotiate questions for the artists and art educators. So if you have any, can you write them into the Q&A segment down below on your menu? Andres?
Okay. All right, so I'm going to conclude with just a little bit of a, I guess, a commentary or a look at this idea of being uprooted from my own perspective. I love my skin. When I look in a mirror, I see the beautiful embodiment of the many ancestral faces that coalesce in the history of my body. I am the product of forced evolution, a representation of the systematic disembodiment that occurred through centuries of colonialist social engineering. When I look at my skin, I remind myself of what my mother always used to tell me. En tu rostro se refleja toda la grandeza del folclore patrio, meaning that in your face, you can see all of the grandeur of the folklore, the myth, the history of your homeland. That's the question. Where is my homeland? No matter how my body twists and contorts to find true acceptance in the spaces through which I move, inhabited by hive-minded prejudices, I hold fast to the lesson history has taught me. Although I exist in the present, I embody the histories and cultural memories of my past. I do not cover my heritage in a blanket of acquiescence, but rather I move forward through the multiple spaces I inhabit as a political and social being, resisting the other and speaking against those who would define and redefine my narrative. I love my skin because my history is written upon it. I think all of us carry with us the history of our lives, the history of our homes. No matter how many times we are uprooted, no matter how many times we are forced to move through time and space and whatever capacity that may be, we carry with us our own histories. For example, what you see here is one of my homelands. I am very much tied to agriculture, to the land, to this idea of cultivation. This is another place I was uprooted to, again, tied to the land. And yet another place that I was uprooted to. I'm a migrant, I come from a migrant family, and I moved throughout all of these spaces, but the thing that grounded me was the fact that they all felt comfortable because they all had similar things. They all represented the idea of growth, that although change happened, it happened for a reason. And I think that's one of the main lessons to take away from this idea of being uprooted. That your identity will always shift and change, but that shifting and changing is something that is grounded in your own history, your own sense of being. All right, so now having said that, are there any questions for our panelists? Questions? Remember to use the little question and answer thing.
I have a question for Raul. You mentioned, oh, that was pages ago. Just Deeds. What is that? Where is that?
Just Seeds.
So it's just seeds.
Oh, Just Seeds.
Yeah, it's a political printmaking cooperative. I think that their warehouse is seems like it's in Pittsburgh.
I can look at it. I just was trying to make sure I.
Yeah, well, they have a strong web presence, and it's really a wonderful resource for anybody, but certainly for teachers and students. I was gonna just paste in because I saw there were 2 questions regarding the materials that I mentioned, and I thought I would just paste. I suppose I can do that in the chat. One question that I saw come across was about what material was used for mud stenciling, and you can use anything that's heavy enough. I know that the technique was actually developed in a class that one of my colleagues, Nicholas Lampert, was giving, and the student that developed it is Jesse Graves, and they started doing it on tar paper. And the tar paper was cheap, and you could do larger things, and it was easy to cut and durable enough, and it didn't let the water or the mud permeate it. but you can use Mylar. The one that I had in the slide that I showed was actually done on just a heavier plastic, and there's no set way. Let me just do that right now. I'll paste Jesse Graves' website in the chat there. He's not that active with it anymore, but I did want to mention one thing. He developed that technique to use for art that was environmentalist, art that was tied to the land, art that he believed in, using a non-toxic material to do that with. Another reason that he used tar paper instead of plastic. And so, and then it was with his permission, as everybody started doing it, because word got around, it actually got posted on the Justice website. It's now been, I think, adapted in a lot of activist circles for these purposes. The other question that I can answer quickly, and again, I'll paste some information, is about the material that's used for the mural that I talked about. And the fabric is called Polytab, and it was actually developed in Philadelphia, the Philadelphia Mural Program, and it's been exported all around the country now, and muralists have been using it for 20 years. I learned about it in San Antonio at the Santano Cultural Center. I saw it being done there, and when I started using it, I called them up and talked to them on the phone. But here are two websites that talk a little bit about it. So
I learned. Oh.
I was going to say for Raul, there's another question from Rebecca Hopp, who said, in what ways does or doesn't your approach change when you're traveling to teach or work outside of the USA? What challenges did you face abroad you didn't expect, and how did you adapt?
Yeah, so it's amazing how the world has changed since I was traveling and living in Mexico. I know Sean has probably had similar experiences living all around the world. There are different perspectives. It does change the context. And one of the reasons I'm so interested in community and community building and community art, and that I didn't actually say, is for me, friendship is always a motive. And so wherever I am, that's my starting spot. And as long as the work that I do begins with that, I always felt at home. I always felt I was invited into the different communities where I lived and worked. So the context changes, but that one element, the friendship, never does. The other thing is I always take however much time it takes. So I have the luxury to do that because I'm an institutional artist. That is, I have the, I have my basic needs covered. So I don't have to make a lot of money to do a large piece. I don't have to make any money. So that aspect of it gives me that possibility. So ever since I started doing, collaborative work based in a university, I can do things like bring artists from Mexico to share their experiences with students here. Those are some of the ways I navigate those, cultural differences.
Well, thank you.
I don't know if I answered exactly. I said some stuff, didn't I?
I think you said a lot of good stuff.
Can I say one more thing?
Sure.
Yeah, I just to Andres, I want to just express my gratitude for your wrapping up of all of our talks, because it speaks so poignantly to, I think, an experience that everybody really lives in one way or another. So, and it was beautifully written. So thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. All right, this is a question for Portia from Chris Bain. I've always been interested in the Gullah Geechee culture. Are there any resources the first artist would suggest for teachers to help us and our students learn more about the Gullah culture and arts?
I cut and paste in a website for that person. There is something called the Gullah Geechee Commission, and it looks at our legacy along the coast of South Carolina, Florida, North Carolina, and I'm missing one other place. Florida, North Carolina, the Carolinas and Florida, or Georgia come to mind. And so I put a link in there. I hope that person could see it. That will take you to the work of the commission, which works to preserve our culture and to tell these stories. And it's active all the time. Another thing is that there was a documentary made of the trip that I took as a cultural exchange. I didn't make the documentary, but South Carolina ETV made a documentary that was shown on ETV like a month ago. And it's called Gullah Roots. I'm not sure that it played in different markets. I know that it's on Vimeo, and if you go to Vimeo and you look up South Carolina ETV, let me see if I can put in here. This says to all panelists, so I'm not sure I'm answering everybody. Anyway, if you go to South Carolina ETV and Vimeo, if you tool around in there, you'll find it, and it's just Gullah Roots. And the password, which they allow you to use, is Salone, Salone, which is another short way of saying Sierra Leone.
Thank you. Here's another question for you. In light of political climates today, have you met with resistance to the ideas you presented? And if so, how have you resolved them?
Is that a question for me or for everyone?
For you.
For me?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. I think I'm always grappling with that question. I was recently in South Carolina, and each time I go, I see the land and the landscape changing. And my initial, I think, motivation for going back down home, my mother no longer lives there, but a great majority of our family members or her cousins are there. And I became involved in the community really as a steward of land that we share called heirs property. So I'm always looking to see what laws are changing around the protections of those spaces that are deeded to entire families. Like the deed to that property was deeded by my great-grandmother in 1891. And so to separate that, there's a lot of, you have to have money, you have to have good lawyers, and you have to have agreements between family members who, every time I look up, somebody's having another baby, that makes them another heir, So I can kind of get, I kind of understand what's changing when I go there, because I can see in a space that had been kind of rural and forgotten about. Now, when you see a new road coming, or you see, new light poles or whatever it might be, telephone lines, it's trees cut out, you understand that gentrification is encroaching. And when you go downtown and you're seeing whole neighborhoods that have been historic Black neighborhoods gone, corporate hotels that are too tall to be in a historic downtown Charleston, and you're seeing cranes. So I'm always grappling with that question of change. And I see it around me in Milwaukee, but I don't think it's really encroaching as much as, and maybe it is, but I just feel like because I'm connected to South Carolina through my storytelling, I notice it more there. If I bring my mother back home, and she's 99 now, if I bring her there, I'll ask her a question and she says, I don't recognize a certain place. You know, it's changed so much. Names, new names of streets are there. So I don't know if I answered the question in the way that the person was seeking, but I think that I see the lack of power through those gestures of people who are land rich, house poor. And then when new stuff comes in or new people who are moneyed come in because they're moving away from the North to the romantic South, it affects us all, and it affects taxes, and people are displaced. You know, so it's always something that I'm going to be grappling with.
Thank you. This is for Sean. Now that virtual teaching is a reality for many, how does cyberspace present another layer to the idea of uprooting?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I think that one of the things that happens, Andres, and the confusion for me, and the thing that I'm working on a lot, and so personally and also with teaching, is that I'm not sure that it presents enough of a confusion. I think that the encroachment of new tools is re-excavating old ideas, and we are solidifying around inequities and in a way that is kind of surprising. I think there's been a lot of optimism in the last 20 years, a tremendous amount of optimism that the internet and the rise of a flat world would create new opportunities for equity. And I actually don't think that's happening. And I think the inequities are racing back with a vengeance under the cloak of new possibilities that aren't being realized. I'm quite concerned about that and quite negative about that. In terms of the, I should clarify, not negative about the potential that we might be able to turn a new leaf as humans who are interested in these ideas, who see these ideas as central to our survival. But I believe that we are too locked into what's been called techno-determinism, for example, that it just needs a new tool. And it's not the way tools work. It's not the way materials work. Ideas and desires become reactivated in new tools. And yeah, I'm very interested in that question, and I'm concerned, deeply concerned, that we might not, we have a lot of work to do. I think that for me, one of the ways that I try to encourage my own students to deal with things like this is to focus on the meaningful storytelling, and how does storytelling emerge differently with different tools, and how can tools be how can we work with tools in combination with other tools, and not get myopically focused on new tools to the exclusion of the tools of our bodies have always known. Anyway, yeah, it's a tough one. I think I just kind of said a lot of confusing things, but it's definitely something that I'm very concerned about.
Oh, that's cool. A question that I thought of was like, do you think that, or how do you think this type of education is, or let me rephrase that. Do you think as educators, we're trying to use technology as the square peg into the students' different way of, because they deal with technology different. So are we imposing something on the students that they don't naturally do with their own technology? And should we be learning from them?
Well, to that, I say wholeheartedly yes. We need to, I believe that we really do need to figure out how to learn from everyone around us. The thing for me is that the tools that we're talking about, for example, Zoom, what we're doing right now, and other computational tools, they're really brand new in the history of human tool creation, and we're still figuring them out. And the tendency to put our hopes on these literally brand new ideas, they literally weren't here yesterday. You can't shake hands with your grandparent and talk to them about we all remember when the first VCR came out. We all remember when then phones no longer had dials and no longer had a dial tone. None of our students have any embodied experience with that. The idea that suddenly that we could flip over, turn a page, and then realize all our hopes and dreams for progressive humanity is just misguided at the deepest extreme. And the problem with that is that these tools were created for profit motives. The tools were not created for the arrival of a new humanity. They were created for the perseverance of the old humanity, for the old feudalisms, for the old power inequities. So the hopes are misguided, I think, deeply misguided. And until we kind of realize where we might find resistance, and I believe that the resistance lies within the cracks and the crannies, the nooks and crannies. The tools are not, they're not the Berlin Wall, and we know how long it took for the Berlin Wall to crumble. These tools potentially are a super Berlin Wall that will remain in effect for generations, and unless we as educators recognize that the nooks and crannies are there and we need to exploit them. So for example, not working with Zoom as if it was a given, integrating many other platforms, free platforms like Scratch. I'm a huge advocate for Scratch. It's free, it's open, it's safe, it's secure, it's built by educators, it's built by people who understand the power of these tools. Yeah, I mean, we have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of work to do.
I would agree. And it's a constantly shifting target. I don't see any other questions. So Rena, would you like to close the session? Or do you want me to close it?
You can go ahead and close. I want to thank everyone for wonderful presentations, insightful takes on the topic through your own work. All excellent.
I really enjoyed the diverse take on the theme of Uprooted. It was so wonderful to see just how different people interpret that one term. I kind of, I really thought about Dawn's idea of, she talks about, or her whole, I guess her whole sense of being, as far as I've known her, has been about grassroots and grassroots arts. And then this idea of uprooting with grassroots, it fascinated me. When you talked about aesthetics and is this doing a disservice, or what is this doing to art? It's like, well, it's uprooting art. And I think sometimes that's necessary. I would like to thank all of you guys for participating and taking time during this very tumultuous, anxious-filled moment in time to give us an opportunity to get to know you and to share your ideas and your thoughts.